a better place to be than inside a lecture hall with no windows on a morning like today. By the way, daylight savings happened last night, so the clock went ahead an hour. In case you're confused as to why you're so tired this morning, I didn't realize that until about 2 seconds ago. Our first presenter, we're going to get right into it, is from Rhode Island. She's a self-proclaimed data nerd through and through, both in the professional and amateur hockey world. She co-hosts a podcast called Balls and Sticks, both hockey and baseball, so that makes sense. Good name for that. And she believes that that a strong and beautiful, effective data viz is very important. She's going to give a talk on aggression and success in goalie pulling. Here is Megan Hall.
Okay, thank you. I am in fact Megan Hall. Thank you all for coming here, both in general and specifically with the first presentation slot on the second day after the time change. I thought there'd be like 4 people here. So thank you all for waking up. And I promise there's no like loud music, flashing lights, or anything that will aggravate anybody who might be a little tired. So I promise. I wish that I had a funny and or profound story as to why I became interested in when teams pull their goalies, but it's actually really boring. It's just at the beginning of this season, I just started getting curious as to when teams actually did pull their goalie, and I couldn't find data. I couldn't find anyone that was collecting this data in a way that was comprehensive enough for my own interest. So I decided to start doing it myself, which led to just a lot of questions that kind of led to this presentation. So the data set that I used for this talk is all the regular season games from the 15-16 season onward, as of a few weeks ago when I was doing this slide, so sometime in February. And so we have almost 4 full seasons worth, which leads to almost 3,000 game situations, which is a decent sample size. And for all of the average data that I'm going to use and talk about later in this presentation, I'm just talking about the earliest goalie pull in a game, because sometimes a team will pull their goalie when they're down by 2, and then they'll give up an empty net goal, put their goalie back in for no reason for like 10 seconds, and then pull them again. So we're only talking about like the earliest pull of the situation. And we divide everything up by what the score difference was at that time, because there's different behaviors, obviously, based on how many goals the trailing team is down by. And as many of you are probably familiar with, just a general disclaimer about NHL data quality, I had to throw out like a handful of games, like 10 to 20, just because the NHL decided that they didn't want to report who the goalie was, ever. So, but overall, we still have a pretty good sample size, I think. And just in case anyone is wondering, I'm not talking about soccer. Very early on when I started talking about this, I tweeted something that definitely said NHL or hockey on it. And some guy with like over 100,000 followers, some soccer guy retweeted it. And for a good 24 hours, I had all these soccer men in my message, like calling me dumb. So I trust all of you are smarter than those people. But just in case, like this is not soccer. I don't know anything about soccer. I think they sometimes pull the goalkeeper in soccer, but I have no idea, and I don't care. So just checking. Bane of my existence are delay penalties. As you're probably aware, teams tend to pull their goalie in exchange for an extra attacker on delay penalty. Those cases are not included here because there's really no risk involved in that situation, obviously, because once you switch possession, then the penalty occurs. The true bane of my existence are plays when there is a delayed penalty and then the team scores a goal and then the penalty just disappears. But those situations are pain to pick out, but those are not included in this data set, just to be clear. All right, so this is a little roadmap of where we're going to go today, and I don't want anyone to get too excited about that second bullet point of when should teams pull their goalie. There's been a lot of good work done in that, and I'm not adding anything to that work. So we're just going to really more be talking about when teams are pulling their goalie, how it's been changing over time, and how close or far it is from those estimates that people have already determined. But I have no new math to add to that. So this is pretty math-like because it's like 9 a.m. on a Sunday. All right, so this is just a little chart of every single goalie pull in the is almost 3,000 games. As you can tell, obviously, the top is 3,600 seconds, aka 60 minutes, the end of the game, and slowly trails downward. If you are more of a histogram person, have one of those too. Again, very concentrated toward the end of the game with a very curious long tail that we will talk about. All right, so most of you probably know Patrick Waugh was the coach in Colorado in 15-16 and was very famous for liking to pull his goalie early, and those data are included in this data set. And side note, I actually had a stress dream last week that I came up here and pronounced his name Patrick Roy, and you all laughed at me. So it's not Patrick Roy. My stress dream did not come true, thank God. So he was, as you again probably anecdotally was well known for pulling his goalie early. And he said, I don't know how true it is, but he said he did look at the numbers, he just went with his gut. So all of these dots here, all of the little pink X's, are all of his goalie pulls just in 15-16. So you can see that almost all of the really aggressive pulls were him in that year. And interestingly, he had a bigger effect on the league. Well, some coaches did say that they pulled their goalie early because of him. I don't think it's enough that we can fully call it the Patrick Waugh effect, but this is all of the goalie pulls in 15-16 that were when the team was trailing by more than 3 goals. So you can see almost all of the really aggressive pulls were in 15-16. And that one gray dot there on the left, if any of you remember, was earlier this year when Tampa pulled their goalie with like 10 minutes ago, which was very exciting. A lot of people told me about that on Twitter, which I appreciate. And now this chart here is all of the pull times, all of these seasons combined when teams were down by 3 or more goals. So if you flip back to this one, which was just 15-16, and all the seasons, again, you can see that almost all of the super aggressive ones were in 15-16. And now here, we're going to focus mostly on the 2-goal and the 1-goal situations, because as we'll see later, those were the ones that actually lead to a larger chance of success in this situation, and they're just a far bulk of the pulls in this data set. So these are all of the goalie pulls that were done when the team was down by 2 goals, and as you can see, the average time, again, all these years put together, is about 2.5 minutes. And we'll talk about this one later. This was out. Again, we'll talk about that one a little bit later, but they stick out. This was real. I didn't quite believe that when I saw it, but I watched the game and this was real. If you look at just the 1-goal differential, let's see, I was afraid of my numbers getting cut off, but they look okay. This is, again, the far bulk. This is like 60% of all the pulls in this data set, because most teams, again, will pull when they're down by 1 goal. And the average, as you would expect, kind of the conventional knowledge, is that it's about 9 seconds, and that's true. All these years combined were about 97 seconds. All right, so moving on to when teams should pull their goalie. This was part of what kind of got me interested in this in the first place, because I think a kind of nifty analogy is in the NFL. I'm not a huge football fan. I don't know that much about the NFL, but even I know that teams should be more aggressive going for it on the 4th down, and the math has showed that for many years, and finally teams are like starting to catch up and become more aggressive. And so I was wondering if the same thing was happening in the NHL, because I think even anecdotally, a lot of people who aren't super into analytics, so probably not the population here, know that the math shows that teams should be pulling their goalie pretty early. And I was curious to see when that was and how far off we actually are. So again, this is the same graph we showed before. This is just all 1 goal, the average of about 90 seconds. And again, there's been a lot of good work done on this, even back like in the 70s. Some guy wrote a paper and suggested that when your team is down by 1, you should be playing with 2.5 minutes to go, which is of course far more aggressive than this. There was a paper that came out last year that said it should be close to 6 minutes when you're down by 1. But what I want to look at today is, most of you are probably familiar with MoneyPuck. MoneyPuck has a poll bot on Twitter that will tell you when teams should mathematically pull their goalie, like in a certain game. And interestingly, they actually have different estimates versus when the team is home versus the team is away, just due to the home versus away differences in scoring rates. But on average, they recommend that you should pull, if you're down by 1, you should pull your goalie with 4 minutes and 10 seconds. And as you can see in this large data set, no one has gotten really even close to that. The couple of X's that like even approach that line are, there was a Colorado poll in 15-16. There was a Toronto poll this year, but again, no one has really gotten close to that line. And the same is true with 2 goals. Again, this is the same chart as before. The average is about 2.5 minutes, and according to Money Puck, the average, what they recommend, their average of home and away is over 6 minutes. But this is the only game in the entire data set, all close to 3,000 games, in which a team actually pulled their goalie at or above what the recommendation was. That was the Dallas game this year against Ottawa. They were down by 2, and they pulled their goalie with like 7 minutes and 50 seconds to go, which is very exciting. And they gave up an empty net goal. So. Sometimes it doesn't. But I applaud their courage. And this is just a quick side note. I was curious, since Money Puck does recommend different pull times based on home and away scoring rates, I was curious to see if teams actually did that. And as you can see, when teams are down by 1 goal or 2 goals, it's basically the same, whether they're home or away, their average time. But if they're down by a lot, then they actually are more willing to pull their goalie sooner when they're on the road. But again, the number of games in this data set in which teams are down by 3 is smaller, so this could just be like random variation. But I was just curious to see if anyone was doing that. All right, so our team's actually becoming more aggressive. Again, we have like 4 seasons here, so I was just curious to see if there had been any progress. And in fact, there has. We talked a little bit about how 15-16 teams were in general more aggressive, but after that, we have gone up like a solid 15 seconds over the past 3 seasons, which isn't a ton, but it also isn't nothing. But if you still compare it to what Money Puck recommends, we're still making slow incremental progress. And the exact same is true when teams are down by 2 goals. We've gone up about 20 seconds over the past 3 seasons, but very far from this mythical line. So slow progress, I suppose. The last thing that I was curious on was, are certain teams more aggressive than others? Because depending on the team probably has a philosophy based on the coach and or the GM, depending on the team as to how aggressive they are. And I was also just curious to see which teams were more aggressive than others. Because this is the fun part where we all get to see where the teams we love or hate are compared to others. So this chart shows every single team how their average pull time, again, we're just focusing on the 1 goal differential because that's the bulk of this data set, how those have changed over these 4 seasons. And so I'll give you a few seconds to make your mental guesses as to who's at the top and who's at the bottom. So starting at the bottom, the Islanders, not very aggressive overall. Same is true for the Flyers and LA, even though LA started out very, very conservative and is slowly getting more aggressive, but it's still kind of at the bottom of the pack. Looks like the very right-hand part of the screen is cut off, but they're still in the bottom, like 5 or 6, but they're slowly making progress, I suppose. Carolina is also tends to be, these are the teams that are on the upper end in terms of being more aggressive. Carolina is up there. St. Louis has actually had the greatest gross change over time. They've gotten about 30 seconds more aggressive over these 4 seasons. And the team that's been the most aggressive every single year has consistently been Toronto. And again, the final year is cut off, but their average this year when down by 1 goal is 150 seconds, 2.5 minutes, which if you remember is the league average for 2 goals. So they have consistently been the most aggressive over these 4 years. And I think it would just be curious as an added area of research to just see if you could match these up to either like coaching or management decisions on the team and see if you could pick out like which coaches and or which GMs tend to promote such an aggressive philosophy. All right, so the last thing that really makes this whole thing worth it is how often does this whole thing actually work? Last fall did just a very small Twitter poll on asking people how often they think that this works. Again, focusing on 1 goal scenarios. How often does the team who is trailing pull their goalie and then either win the game or tie the game. So they get a standing point that they wouldn't have gotten otherwise. And the bulk of people guessed that the correct answer was 11%. And actually, over the past 2 seasons, it's about 15%. So, I mean, 15% is not nothing, especially when, I mean, obviously every year we have teams that just barely squeak into the playoffs or just barely miss the playoffs. And so focusing on this is important in order to kind of garner that last possible edge. Teams are looking for every edge, and having this as a tactic that works 15% of the time, that's not too bad. Of course, if you expand the pool to all goal differential situations, it goes down to about 9% because it's quite rare it has happened that a team has been down by 2, pulled their goalie and gone on to win the game. It doesn't happen very often. And I don't think in this data set it has happened at all if the team was down by 3 or more. But they should just be pulling them much sooner in that scenario. And also, this is kind of what I feel is the most interesting. So this is how the average pull time, again, sticking with 1 goal differential, this is how the average pull time has changed over the 4 seasons based on the outcome of that pull. So as you can see, the pink line on the top are situations in which the trailing team went on to win or tie the game. And it's consistently higher. Those result from more, on average, from more aggressive pulls. So I think there is more that you could look into here, but I think there's definitely evidence that teams should be pulling their goalie sooner in order to increase their chances of a favorable outcome. I think there's a lot of opportunity here in areas for further study. I'm curious, again, as I mentioned, this was just regular season that I looked at. I'd be curious to see how this changes in the playoffs, if teams probably become more conservative or maybe even if teams become more aggressive. Also, again, this was just 4 years of data. I would like to look at some years previous to this to see if the 15-16 year was part of a general growing trend, and then we had just a little bit of a regression in 16-17, or if that 1 year was just kind of an outlier. And that's just was the constraints of this particular data that I was working with. Yeah, as you can see, is basically what I just said. So these are all of the goals, these are all of the games put together, and there was a spike in 15-16. So I'm just curious to see if that was consistent or if that was kind of an outlier all on its own. Also, I think it'd be interesting to do more in-depth study on 6 versus 4 in terms of deployment and outcomes. Matt Kane has written some about when teams should pull their goalie on a power play, and just from having access to all of this data, like it's clear that that does happen. That, again, was not the focus of this talk, but I think it's interesting because as you can see, this is just a super quick goals for per 60 and goals against per 60 by strength state. Of course, as you are taking away more skaters from the other team, your goals against are going down and your goals for are going up. So I think more in-depth study on that would also be interesting. Lastly, looking at individual team performance on 6 versus 5 would be interesting in terms of that's like an actual repeatable skill. I would assume that most teams do not devote much practice time to playing with 6 skaters. But again, if we're hoping that teams get more aggressive and pulling their goalie earlier in hopes for more successful outcomes, it would be interesting to see if teams specifically are actually good or not good at 6 on 5 versus 5 versus 6. Because as you can see, I'm not going to go too in-depth into these specific numbers because that wasn't the point of this talk, but this is the goals for per 60 by team at 6 versus 5, and there's just, there's a large variation in both, again, goals for per 60 and goals against per 60. And again, we're dealing with a fairly small sample size in terms of the team at the team level, but again, I'd be curious to see that. This is it in a nutshell, basically. The teams need to be more aggressive. I appreciate everyone, again, tags me on Twitter when teams pull their goalie really early, especially in other leagues. Someone even told me once about, I think it was like in their beer league that they pulled their goalie like in the second period. But I think there was a paper that came out, I think last year, that said if you're down by, I forget what it is, 4 or 5, you just like pull whatever. Like whenever you're down by 4, like if it's in the first or the second, like just pull them. So I appreciate seeing what other leagues are doing. And I would also, just to add to the further study, I can't imagine that this data would be at all easy to collect, but seeing what happens if any AHL teams were more experimental in this, would also be really interesting. But again, AHL data tends to be a nightmare in general, and especially I would assume at this level. But that would also be interesting to see about that. So as I was doing this, as I was tracking these goalie polls starting from last year, I did have a data viz on my Tableau page that was tracking basically all the things that I was interested in goalie polling. So when teams were polling their goalie, which teams were giving up the most empty net goals, which teams were having the most success, etc. This data is frozen at the moment. This dashboard is still live on my Tableau page, but it's frozen from a couple months ago because I did a big data refresh. But there will be a new version coming out hopefully next week because I'm still tracking this because I still think that it's interesting. So I will be putting something definitely on my Twitter when that is up. So if you're interested in that, follow me and I will let you know when the new data is up. Just wanted to give an extra thank you to the organizers of this conference and a thank you to all of the wonderful people out there who provide this data for us. Me personally, I use data from Manny and from the Evolving Wild Twins, so please support people who are doing all the work to give you this data. It's very important. So, thank you.
All right, our next presenter, thank you, Megan, by the way, that was awesome. I've been wondering about pull the goalie data for a long time, so it's fun to see that. All right, so our next presenter is this incredibly sharply dressed man next to me. He hails from Boston. He is the head of hockey performance and sports science at UMass Lowell. He oversees physical development of NCAA Division I hockey team there, and that includes sports science, performance analytics, strength and conditioning, nutrition, recovery, and sleep science. His speech is called Digging Deeper with the Data, a sports science approach to hockey development. Put your hands together for Devin McConnell.
Okay, thank you very much. One correction, I don't hail from Boston. I actually hail from here. I grew up in the Seattle area. I haven't been back in close to a decade, so it's really exciting. It's kind of a homecoming for me to get to come here and speak to you, so I appreciate the opportunity. But yes, director or head of hockey performance and sports science. My job is to do everything we can off the ice to help our players be better on the ice. It's the training, the strength and conditioning, the nutrition. It's also the sports science. It's one sort of component of what we do. So that's what I'm going to talk about today, digging deeper with the data, basically how we use our sports science and our physiological data to drive player development. So there's really three kind of categories or three buckets that we think of in terms of our sports science program. The first component, the first bucket is readiness monitoring. This is trying to better understand on a daily basis where our athletes are. So who are they walking in the door? So we can make more informed decisions about the training process, the practice process, etc. The second layer for us is profiling, performance KPIs. This is really about understanding how the athlete themselves are built on an individual basis. What makes them tick physiologically? Where are their strengths and weaknesses? And this allows us to make, again, more informed decisions in the training process so we avoid the pitfalls of just doing work for work's sake. And then the third piece of the puzzle, from a sports science standpoint, is internal load tracking and tactical periodization. And this is really the crossover from kind of in the weight room and the training side of things to on the ice, and how we better understand the physiological load that's occurring with our athletes in practice and in games, and then how tactical periodization is really about how we structure our week, how we structure our practices from a physiological perspective to try to achieve the highest level of readiness on game day, but also sort of skate the fine line for long-term player development. So readiness monitoring is really, like I said, what do we need to do today, right? We want to do essentially the least amount possible. We want the minimal effective dose physiologically to drive performance, to drive adaptation. We're not trying to do the most that we possibly can on any given day. So we want to have a better understanding of where our players are when they walk in the door. We want to know, are we on track with our plan? We have a plan set out for the week, for the month, for the year. Are we on point? Are we on plan? Do we need to make some adjustments, either in training or on the ice or whatever it is? So that's really readiness monitoring, is trying to figure out who our players are on any given day. And the first sort of layer of this for us is subjective wellness questionnaires, really basic. Our athletes have an app on their phone where they fill out a brief questionnaire every morning. And I sit at my desk and I get this dashboard in the background that sort of populates on a live basis. So as the athletes come into the arena or before they get there, they're filling out this questionnaire and just giving us a little bit of feedback about how they're feeling that day. What's their sleep quality, their mood, their fatigue level, their soreness, etc. And the really important part of this for us is that I have 30 athletes on our roster. I have about 3 minutes when they walk in the door to make a decision about what we're going to do that day in training, or if I need to relay some information to sports medicine or the coaching staff. 3 minutes is not enough time to have an in-depth conversation with 30 individuals. But if I can identify a couple of red flags and figure out who I need to talk to, then I can make sure I bump into those players. In this example, if you look at the column for muscle soreness, on this day, pretty much nobody is sore. Blues and greens are really good. Yellows are averages. Reds are below their rolling average. So in this case, I've got one player that's a little bit outside. He's a little bit of an outlier. I can dig into that a little bit deeper and start to look at his information and see, is there anything that I've missed? What are his trends look like? Is there any kind of red flags there? This picture is just his overall readiness score. So Blue, even though he's flagged himself as sore today, overall he's doing pretty good relative to his normal. But on the body map, we see that he's tagged a level of pain in his left leg, his left quad. So before the athletes come in, I have all this information, and I can make sure I go up to Johnny or to Derek and say, hey, what's going on? I know you're a little bit more sore than usual. I see that you've got something going on. Is anything wrong? Do we need to do anything? Do we need to make an intervention? Could be nothing, could be something, but it's our sort of first layer of defense. And we're really transparent about our information. I know this is sort of a hot topic when it comes to sort of who owns data and who looks at data and things like that. In our setting and in my feeling, I think it's really important to be transparent with the information. So we put the information up on the TV screen for the athletes to see, so they know where they're at, they know where everybody else is at. There's no secrets, there's no sort of man behind the curtain with our information. And I think, sort of as an aside, I think it's really important from a buy-in and from a culture standpoint for athletes to have an understanding of what's going on. I'm not just collecting information to collect it. It's usable and it's actionable data. And it's there, the purpose is to improve their performance. They're very motivated individuals, motivated athletes. If they understand the process on the back end that is all about trying to help them perform better and help the team perform better, there's a lot more buy-in. So the next kind of layer from a readiness standpoint is now more of an objective measure of readiness. We call this the reactive strength index test. So what you see here is something we go through before training a couple times a week. The athletes simply step off the bench. They're landing on a contact mat, which I'll show you in a minute again in another picture, but this basically measures how high they jump and how quickly they do it. And that's a pretty good indicator of their central nervous system readiness. So just how many cylinders is their engine firing on today? So again, all these layers help to inform where our athletes are at on any given day. Is this a day we can hit the gas pedal? Is this a day we need to back off a little bit? We can make fine-tuned adjustments as we go by looking at some of these things. The next layer for us in sports science is about profiling. So we want to understand and we want to develop KPIs around what makes our athletes successful. What are the differences that we need to look at in training positionally? From an individual level, 30 individuals in the training process, everybody's built a little bit differently, so we want to have a better understanding of what that kind of looks like and what we need to do in training. See if this video will run. So again, this is a guy. Oh boy.
Uh-oh.
First problem of the day, that's good. So the first layer, we'll see if we can get it going again, but the first layer of profiling is really simple in my world, and it's basically vertical jump testing. So we use, as I talked about previously, we use jump mats, which are very, very basic technology. They simply measure how high an individual jumps and how long they're spending on the ground. And we can do a bunch of different sort of variations of jumping that provide different peaks to how they're built and how they produce force. This is really important because vertical jumping is correlated really strongly with skating speed. So speed development in our program is a major KPI. It's a big component of our program and our team. So we want to make sure that we're doing whatever is necessary to improve guys' speed over time, improve their explosiveness over the course of their careers. We also want to use this data to make sure that we're evaluating fatigue levels. We want to see players peaking and getting better as the course of the year goes on. We want to see players at their best as we go into the playoffs. So by using a really simple tool like a jump map, we can evaluate where a player is at over time and relative to the rest of the group. And we can start to identify some of the strengths and weaknesses behind that. The next layer, we'll see if we get it up, but the next layer from there that basically adds a little bit of nuance from just looking at jump height, which is an important metric, but there's more nuance to it, is to use force plates. So force plates allow us to do, again, different types of jumps or different types of movements, but actually tell us more about how an athlete produces force. We may have two players that both jump the same height, but how they get there is different. Their strategy to get there is different. Their sort of neurological makeup and how their body responds or how their body produces force is different. And that's hugely important in the training process to know the strengths and weaknesses of different individuals and what we can do from in our training to affect those things. We're not just trying to do work for work's sake. The weight room, the training process is not just about making people tired. We're trying to dig in a little bit deeper and understand what makes somebody tick, what are their strengths, what are their weaknesses, and how can we impact that? Almost there. Do I get bonus time for this? I'll just keep talking.
I have a question.
Yes, absolutely.
Have you noticed whether when you put player information up on a dashboard that's available for everyone to see if that creates any perverse incentives, like people, perhaps because they know that everyone else on the team is going to see their wellness state, do you notice that they report things differently?
That's a great question. No, but I think there's concern for that, but I think an underlying component to all of this for us, and it's a different talk, but all of the sports science, all of the information is preceded by a great culture. We're fortunate to have a really good culture in our organization, in our locker room, where our athletes buy into the process, they buy into what we're doing with them and why. And that's from the coaching staff down. We have a very open lines of communication in our program. And so our culture is really strong. So our players understand that the purpose of what I'm doing is about helping them to improve, helping them to get better. It's not information that's used to make lineup decisions. That's not how we use it. But we can't get there, and we haven't gotten to that point. You know, I'm 8 years into the process at Lowell. We haven't gotten to that point using what we can do now without building a culture where that's part of the process. Yeah.
All right, guys. We could have 10 right after this. I know it's kind of a starter stuff, but if we do 10 and then keep going after.
That's fine with me.
All right. Take 10, everybody. We have another cup of coffee. We'll be back momentarily. Come back at 47.
9:47.
Okay.
I watch when on PC. I was just saying I did drink my birthday, so. Oh yeah. And then I wasn't really into it initially. It really made it, and I'm like,
Okay, sorry.
Yeah, file for
yeah, I'm just trying to see the other options. Yeah, it's something I'm gonna make something new this week.
Oh, wow. Oh, I didn't. Okay. So that I guess I did get this.
Sorry, I came down early last night. I got to like
It's all good. We ended up just like just really to the hotel house and then right there. I saw the roof from when we were in there.
yeah.
Yeah, I will make it considered after we get back here. I didn't even realize that happened. Yeah, go back.
I went over to the kitchen and I looked at the microwave and I was like, yeah. And then I, yeah.
I really like it. I'm gonna check it out.
Yeah, they don't have people
I can actually it's the same archive.
What?
They're both they're
I have that. No,
but like even when I was in Japan, I just like we did like I used to like something like just give me a meal. I miss Sukiya so much. 100 yen. He's not saying like no, it's actually I got there and I've never had like such a good experience. Yeah, I'm shocked when they're gone. It's probably gonna make you angry, but I'm definitely. I was okay with such a okay, and then we found like a second room to learn. Then we went to the thing, and then I had a studio there. Randy was like, you need to be ready. And so I'm looking around and it's yeah, it was Greg and I, and he was a mix. I think Randy found it, and then Blair and
What now?
They see my hat and he knows what we do at the video.
Doing it, keep trying to sit on this side. No, I'm gonna also have to go I'm not going to I'm going to do one.
Well, I mean, like, I was like, super that, but like, I used secondary events. Like, all getting driving back from that increases. I'm continuing to stuff later, but it's just a waste of hard I think a lot of it.
Which is part 5. Like that.
Okay, I think we're gonna try this again. You want me to get going? So, I'll try to pick back up kind of where we ended, where I think we ended. Okay, so kind of started talking about profiling, basically just trying to understand who each individual is, how they're built, and what we can do to be a little bit more nuanced in training to improve performance. Okay, not everybody's built the same way, not everybody has the same needs or the same roles. We want to take all these things into account, but physiologically we want to start to break down how people do things. So layer 1, really simple, just looking at vertical jump height. Again, correlate very strongly to sprint speed, which is the major KPI in our program. So we just want to be able to track this and track this quickly and easily over time. One thing that I didn't touch on, but is a really important component in sports science, is having systems built into your process. So all of the data we collect, all the sports science, is not a separate thing. It's not a lab. The athletes don't have to go and do another thing or a different thing. It's just built into our training process. We collect all of this stuff in, like this is within a typical in-season training list. It's just part of what they do. On the back end, then we can look at that more in depth to better understand what's going on. And again, a little bit more nuanced than just jump height, okay, is using technology like a force plate, which starts to identify left to right asymmetries. Does a player produce more force on one leg or the other, which can be indicative of potential future injury? We can break down, again, how do they jump? How do they produce force? Some athletes are going to need these types of exercises. Some athletes are going to need those types of exercises. But if we can be more nuanced about that, then hopefully we can make more informed decisions in the training process moving forward. The next layer is force velocity profiling, and this uses a tool called velocity-based training, which basically, so we go from measuring sort of or analyzing outcomes to analyzing the actual performance practices. So we can look at our different exercises that we utilize, and we can look at power outputs and speeds and things like that. And again, better understand which exercise for which individual at which time to get the desired response. We're not just doing stuff. It's not just going to the gym to get a sweat or to lift the heaviest thing possible or whatever. It's about using these tools very specifically and using the right tool at the right time to improve whatever that performance outcome needs to be. The last layer for us is internal load monitoring. So this is sort of the wearable area. Interesting kind of side conversation. We probably are able to do some more things at the college level from the sports science standpoint than is possible at the NHL level right now due to collective bargaining agreement stuff. We can wear heart rate based technology, which is what I'm going to show you in games. That's not, you can't do that in the NHL right now. So our players wear a heart rate system basically that measures workloads and heart rate intensities and all of these things in training and practice in games. So we have a wealth of data about physiologically what's happening on the ice. This is the actual heart rate trace of a player during a game. So just visually what we can look at, in this case right after the game, one of the most telling things for us, whether an athlete is sort of in hockey shape or not, is really how well they recover between shifts. That's the key performance indicator physiologically. It's not the intensity level they get to. They're all going to get to a high intensity, a 90, 95, 100% max heart rate during competition. It's how quickly do they recover in between that. That's what's really going to tell us about where their sort of hockey-specific fitness is. We can break that information down, dig a little bit deeper, and look into something like this, which is 5-minute segments of that same heart rate information. So this is kind of an interesting case study. This was a player that came to me after a game, he said, Devin, I don't understand what's going on. My legs feel terrible in the first period. I feel like I'm skating in quicksand. Second period, third period, I feel fantastic. But in the first period, I can't get moving. Well, let's take a look at the information and see what we see. I ask him, okay, we've got warm up, first, second, third. What one thing doesn't look like the other? Okay, lots of red during the game, 0 red, 0 time above 90% heart rate in warm-ups. The colors I adjusted for the talk, but basically the level of intensity that his heart got to in warm-up was about 70% max heart rate. I'm at 70% max heart rate right now. So he warmed up at this intensity and then all of a sudden had to jump into a game and go to 100% intensity. I said, okay, what do you think we could do differently to help improve what's going on? Why don't we increase the intensity of the warm-up a little bit so that you don't feel terrible in the first period? The basic premise I tell them, let's make you feel like crap in warm-ups. You'll adapt to that during the intermission, and then the first period you're going to be fine, and that's what we've done. And it's actually something that we look at over the course of the entire team. We had enough guys with sort of the same critique. We actually altered our on-ice warm-up to make sure that we were having higher speeds and higher intensities before our game. I literally will stand on the bench with my iPad running with the heart rate data, and guys will come over to me at the end of warm-up to see if they've sort of gotten to the appropriate level. And if not, they'll add a couple of sprints or a couple of over and backs or whatever it is, just to get up to that level. So we're using this data in an actionable way to drive not just long-term sort of performance development, but short-term improvements in game performance. Again, digging a little deeper, we can look at the data on the back end. We can actually quantify what's called training load, which is basically, think of it as sort of mileage of your car, right? It's how much work was done over the course of the game. And with data context is always important, right? We see that if you look at that training load, almost all the athletes are somewhere in the 200 range. There's 2 athletes that are well above 300 in this. Okay, so what's going on with these 2 athletes? Are they woefully out of shape? Or are they our top 2D and they have to kill 3 penalties back to back to back? Or what's happening here? We don't know just looking at it, but being able to quantify that and look at this after the fact and say, okay, maybe these are our top 2D, maybe they had the game of their life, and maybe tomorrow, instead of getting on the ice for practice, maybe they need a recovery day, a regen day, right? So how can we manipulate, not necessarily pulling them out of games to try to recover and improve readiness over time, but where can we find other avenues to try to improve performance? Maybe some of these guys need to put some work in after the game because their workloads were very high. They have a window of opportunity to improve, and other guys we need to back off on. Tactical periodization, if anybody is a soccer person in here, you're probably familiar with the term. The way we think about it is not exactly from that world, so don't at me about that if that's where you're at. But tactical periodization for us is using our heart rate data, using our workload data to plan what we're going to do in practice. We're not just trying to redline every single day, right? We're going to run out of gas by the time we get to game day. We want to make sure that we're manipulating workloads to improve readiness, right? We play Friday and Saturday night in college hockey every week, pretty much. So we know we can structure the week in an appropriate manner. We can have days of higher workload, days of lower workload or recovery basis to improve performance on game day. And we're able to sort of look at that retroactively and see, okay, when we structure things in a certain way, what are our wellness scores? What are our reactive strength index scores? What's our wins and losses look like when we do that over the course of time? So we can actually use our data to structure where we kind of hit the gas pedal and where we pull back. Because a lot of people don't realize that the biggest physiological load that an athlete is under is not the hour and a half or 2 hours a week that they're in the training room or the weight room with me. It's what happens on the ice in practice and in games. So if we can measure that, and then backtrack and utilize that to apply stress at the right time, we can really end up driving long-term performance and development. Right? So we graph this stuff, we can quantify it tons of different ways, but we'll look at workloads week to week, we'll look at intensity rates day to day, overall workloads. So again, we can look at this stuff and educate the educators, as I like to say, inform the coaching staff and the people that are going to make the decisions about, hey, this is what's going on. This is what we did this week. I'm not telling you it's right or wrong, but I'm telling you this is exactly what the workloads were so we can make more informed decisions moving forward. One of the ways that we do that is with we call it a drill map, okay? So this is every drill we've run in practice during the year. basically filtered for intensity level or training load per minute. So how hard is this drill on average for the group? And we can break it down by position. So we know, our coaches know, okay, if this is going to be a high intensity day, we probably want to pick some drills from the red area. Those are our more high intensity workload drills. If we want a more low intensity day, let's stay more on the blue end of the curve. But we can look, again, use this information on the back end to inform the process moving forward. And then just as kind of an interesting case study, we went this season on a really good tear after the Christmas break. We strung off 9 or 10 in a row, but towards the end of that, things started to fall off a little bit. We were still being pretty successful on the ice and winning, but we were a little bit more sporadic. I looked back at our data and I said, okay, we're not happy with the consistency. And just from a physiological perspective, I can tell you that over these 5 weeks, even though we've won, we've done it differently over the course of the week, every week. So if we're expecting consistency, but we're being inconsistent, we're probably not putting things together very well. So being able to, again, use this information just to illustrate exactly what's happening so we can make more informed decisions. And then kind of the last layer, I touched on it, but, and I think following along yesterday on Twitter, because I couldn't be here, it seems to be a running theme. Making sure that your data is communicated in a way that makes sense to the shareholders, right? It's all of the data, all of the science is really exciting for me in my world, but if I can't communicate to our coaches in terms and in language that they understand and appreciate, then it's useless. It doesn't matter. Same thing with the players. You have to learn to speak coach. You have to learn to speak player. So when I send out reports, I make sure that I know how our coaches want to see the data and want to see the information. Our head coach likes bullet points. Give me three lines. He doesn't care about pictures and graphs. Our assistant coaches, they like shiny things. So we put pictures and colors in there. But knowing who you're talking to and how to get the message across is really, really important. So I'll finish up with that, guys. Thank you very much. Sorry about the interruption. Hopefully it went well.
All right, thank you, Devin. How about Devin just rolling with a 10-minute break in the middle of his speech? That was outstanding. Very interesting stuff. Our next presenter, we have 2 in a row now from SportLogic. So the first of the 2 SportLogic presenters is Connor Jung. He comes from Montreal, obviously, as do the other SportLogic guys. Makes sense. He is a data analyst at SportLogic, developing reports using spatial temporal event data for clients. Co-founded the hockey analytics department for the Queens Golden Gales. There you go, at Queens University. He played 3 seasons of junior hockey before embarking on his journey in sports analytics. Please join me in welcoming to give his speech on the effective handedness in playing defense. Please join me in welcoming Connor Jung.
Awesome. I just wanted to echo the statement that Megan had said. Just wanted to thank the organizers for hosting the event. Hosting any type of conference is really, really difficult. So I just wanted to give you guys a shout out. So my name is Connor. As in my intro, I work at SportLogic. I do data analytics for them, and the project that I worked on is the effective handedness on defensemen in the NHL. I joined the team about a little bit over a month ago, and on my second day, David, who you guys saw yesterday, asked me if I wanted to present at SeaHAC, and I said, "What?" It was a cool experience though, just because I got to kind of explore the data that we have and kind of dive into a topic that has really kind of taken I guess the league by storm, just because Tyler Dello's kind of written about it. There's been work done on the effective handedness, and obviously read an article by Allison last week about how players kind of choose their handedness, and so I thought it's pretty topical. So let's keep going. So what we're going to look at today is what handedness and why it's important. We're going to look at two types of events. We're going to look at on-puck events we're going to look at off-puck events. We're going to look specifically at the D zone, and we'll talk. I'll explain that as we go along, and then we're going to look at some conclusions and some next steps. Okay. So what-handedness? Again, as Allison pointed out, it's a little bit arbitrary. I'm right-handed and I shoot right, but some people say that if you write with your right hand, that the top hand goes on your top of the stick, and that makes you left-handed. So it's kind of weird, and so it's a little bit arbitrary. So I like to define it as the side of the ice that you mostly play on. So if you're right-handed, you mostly play on the right side of the ice. If you're left-handed, you play on the left side of the ice. Handedness affects your tendencies. Most players like to play and make plays on their forehand. I'd like to do the same thing. For example, like in warm-ups, I only turn left after I shoot on goal. Like it's the only thing that it affects, how you turn, how you shoot. So it really is important. And as I mentioned, there's a forehand and a backhand. So the actions you make on a puck are not created equally. Most players will bias towards making plays on their forehand. So why is it important? So 60% of NHL defensemen over the last 3 years who played over 100 minutes are left-handed. Handedness forces you to have a strong or weak side, right? So if you're a left-handed defenseman, you're playing on your left side, that's the strong side. If you're a left-handed defenseman playing on your right side, that's your weak side. There's been prior research done, and just kind of pointing to a graph that was in a blog post in Hockey Graphs by Dom Gavamini. You can see that there's been a trend toward more true-sided pairings, which is a left-right pairing, and it's kind of tailed off around 20-25%. And so coaches are pretty rigid when it comes to playing players on their strong side, and we'll get into that as we get into this. So I kind of wanted to show a quick little video of Mike Babcock kind of explaining why he prefers two-side pairings. I'm gonna slow it down because the guy's like from Saskatchewan and talks really, really fast. And like I slowed it down to like 75% speed, and he's still talking really fast. So we're just gonna listen to the question from Pierre. Oh, is there no volume?
There's a bit of a volume issue.
That's okay. So I can kind of just sum it up. So Mike Babcock talks about kind of three plays. There's a play where off of a face-off, if you have two left-handed defensemen, you have one who passes it to the other, he has it on his backhand, and so if he's on the right side of the ice, he's either just going to rim the puck around or dump it out, essentially. There's a play that you're talking about in the offensive zone. If the puck comes up the boards on a cycle, he's just going to rim it right back down because he can't, on his backhand, go B to B. And the last play he talked about was in the neutral zone, where you're in a regroup. If you receive a pass on your backhand and you're drifting towards the right boards, if you're a left-handed defenseman, you're not able to go cross the ice again and hit a guy on a stretch pass. You're going probably up the boards. So the scope of this project focuses on the NHL. The initial analysis looks at event-level data that we are tracking at SportLogic. We're looking at player-level data, but we're not looking at pairing level. Again, like I said, we're focusing on the D zone because we kind of wanted to validate some ground truths. That being said, we wanted to kind of look at the D zone because prior work has been done, whether it was Dom or Tyler Dello, looking at shot shares, the shot rates, and the offensive side of the game. But if the coach doesn't trust you to be on the ice, you're not going to be able to produce offense regardless. So we kind of wanted to look at what makes a defenseman successful, what makes a defenseman allow to be on the ice in the first place. Okay, so there was a common thread in Mike Babcock's kind of presser where he was kind of talking about what a defenseman does with the puck. And so we wanted to look at the next play decision-making of these players. And so the first thing we wanted to look at were plays that follow a pass reception on a defenseman's strong or weak side, and looking at the next play. And so being fortunate enough to use sport logic data where we have XY coordinates, the sequence of events, and what happens next, we can kind of see tendencies at an aggregate for defensemen and what they do as soon as they receive a pass in the defensive zone. So just have to kind of go over some definitions. So next play percentages looks at successful next plays over all plays. A successful play would be anything from a completed pass, a puck protection, maintaining possession, and dump outs. The next term is north pass attempt rates. And so that's basically the number of north passes. So that's just directly forward over all of the passes on your next play. And then completion percentage as well as dump out rates. So again, touching back on Allison's talk on storytelling and data-driven storytelling, I didn't have time to clean up this table, but I think the key table to look at would be the top one, where we're kind of looking at strong side versus weak side, and then again on these 4 metrics. So you can see that on your strong side for all defensemen, your next play percentage is higher on your strong side. What's interesting is this next play north pass attempt rate, where on your weak side, you're passing more often going north. And so that kind of intuitively makes sense, because when you're on your strong side, on your weak side, and you've opened up, and you're on your weak side, if you're a left-handed defenseman, you can't necessarily go to the middle as much. And so you're going to be, because you're bounded by the right boards, you're going to be going north. But what's also interesting is that the next play north pass completion percentage is actually lower. And so not only are defensemen more predictable in going north, they're actually less successful when they do. And again, next play dump out rate is lower for players on their weak side. Okay, so this one you don't necessarily need sound for, but this was kind of to demonstrate.
On the breakup. A little across the line. That's right. A little to the right wing. Roll up high here for Roll. Right back to Myers.
Starts around 17 seconds.
Flipping it back to the point. Long shot for Rocky.
Okay, so we have Dean Kukan, who's number 14 for Columbus, and he picks up the puck right here in the corner. He's a left-handed shot. He's going into the right boards, and he's playing his weak side. And so you can see, because he's on his backhand and Blake Wheeler's applying pressure, he only really has one option, and that's to go up the boards.
Corner by Dean Kukan, who gets an opportunity to play in the lineup here tonight.
The play gets broken up, and I think this is really interesting. So again, he's on his weak side, and we talked about tendencies. And so because he's a left-handed defenseman, he's usually more comfortable with pivoting to his left. And so he's completely turned around. And so this play. Yes, I cherry-picked that example. Okay, so he's owned dump outs and passes. So we wanted to look at, is there data to validate that kind of example? And it's actually pretty stark. So if you look, there's a 40% increase for both left-handed D and right-handed D using the boards for dump outs on their weak side. And so again, that kind of validates the ground truth, where if you're on your weak side, you have a lot more trouble kind of making an outlet pass, and you really only have a few options of going up the boards. Your D-zone pass to dump out ratio is also affected by your side. And so you do dump the puck out more as opposed to passing the puck out more in for D-zone exits. Okay, passing directionality. So this is pretty cool. So from the last, for the last couple of graphs kind of showed that defenseman passing tendencies change on their weak side. They're more inclined to go north. Their passing percentage is lower, and their pass to dump out ratio is lower as well on their weak side. And so we kind of wanted to look at all passes. and tendencies from lefties and righties on their strong and weak side to see if there's any kind of aggregate differences between the patterns that you would see across the league. And so the data that we used were all successful passes that were plotted, failed passes were not. We used 5-on-5 even strength passes only, spanning from the 2016-17 season to the 2018-19 season. Some initial results were kind of cool. So strong side, lefties and righties mirror pass tendencies in the D zone. Basically, it's a direct mirror. You could plot left-handed Ds, pass sonars. You could reflect it on the middle axis, and it looks the exact same on the other side. But what was interesting is some left-handed D on their weak side look exactly like the league average right-handed D on their strong side. Okay, so this is strong right-handed D on their strong side, so right-handed D on the right boards, and left-handed D on the right board. So this is kind of showing, because there's an imbalance in the NHL, can there be more left-handed players who can play on the right side? And so you can see right off the bat from the two graphs in the middle that the passing tendencies for lefties and righties are very, very different. So the size of these sonars are the number of, let's see, let's double check here. It's the count. So it's how often they will pass in that direction. And the color density is actually the average distance. So the darker the distance, or the darker the color, the farther on average those passes are. And so what you can see here is, on average, right-handed D will go north, and they can make a longer stretch pass. They'll go E to D more often, and they won't use the board as much. Whereas left D on their weak side will not be able to make as far north passes on average, and they use the boards a lot. Within 5 feet is something that we looked at a lot, just because in hockey it's a lot different than any other sport where you're kind of bounded by this by the boards, and you can't really go out of bounds essentially. So you kind of have to use the rink as part of the game. And you can see the effects of passes within 5 feet of the boards. Right-handed D are still able to kind of go to the middle, and so those are those outlet passes, maybe hitting the center, going directly across ice. But again, you can see the tendencies and the differences between lefties and righties on the strong and weak sides. So lefties are forced to go up the wall, or reverse, go behind the net, and so that you can kind of see how that may seem to be worse, where if you're moving backwards in your defensive zone, most coaches want to move forward and exit the zone, as opposed to maybe regrouping in your defensive zone and spending more time in the D zone. So why don't we look at the player level? So I talked about how some left-handed D on their weak side look a lot like right-handed D on their strong side. The perfect example here is Nicholas Jarlsson. He looks identical to a league average right-handed D in all passing directionalities, as well as average distance. So I thought this was really, really cool. So it kind of shows that there might be a skill to this, where it can be taught that if a guy who's left-handed and wants to play on its weak side can learn that over time. So it's been known that Jarlsson has played on his weak side for many years. So it makes sense that he kind of looks like a right-handed defenseman now. Yes.
Assumption that he's using his forehand or his backhand, or is it all?
There are no assumptions whether he's using his forehand or backhand. It's just the total number of passes that he's completed and the average distance as well. So there are other players who kind of exude those same types of qualities. So there's guys like Jordan Osterley, Jussi Riikola, Dennis Seidenberg, and Nate Schmidt, guys who play on their weak side, maybe not predominantly, but players who do tend to be on the right side of the ice, who kind of look like right-handed defensemen, which is kind of cool. Okay, zone entries. So this was an area that we thought was interesting, because passing is important, but playing defense is also really important for defenders, right? So the hypothesis that we had was defenseman handedness does affect the ability to defend entries. We didn't really know if there was actually going to be a causal relationship or any types of results here. We just kind of wanted to take zone entries to see if there was any difference in handedness to affect players' abilities to break up zone rushes. The data that we used were only including 2-on-2 rushes, 3-on-2 rushes, and 3-on-3 rushes. This is because we wanted to control the fact that zones and rushes can be a little bit noisy, and we really wanted to isolate the impact of an individual player to be on that side of the ice, being tagged for a zone entry against, and having a material impact on defending that play. We looked at, again, 5-on-5 even strength entries only spanning the 2016-17 season to this season. The one thing that throughout this entire exploratory analysis was we started seeing different types of zone entries where, and it kind of aligns with the hockey lexicon where not all zone entries are made equal, and it matters where you enter the zone. And so we kind of built these kind of arbitrary channels. We kind of wanted to test to see if where you enter in the zone matters. And so we broke this up into an outside entry and a middle entry. And so you can kind of see on this plot here that outside entries are the entries that are tagged from the dots to the boards. And then the middle entries are from the dots to the middle of the ice, and then that's flipped when you're on your strong or weak side. So this is Jake Muzzin. I wanted to pick on the Leafs a little bit because I'm a Vancouver fan, and we're not very good. And so we wanted to look at this gap distance. So one of the big things with defensemen, as you're taught to play, is you want to have a tight gap. What that means is the distance between you and the offensive player is perceived as your gap distance. Okay, so do defensemen concede more zone entries because of their size? So if you look at strong versus weak, there doesn't seem to be an effect on players' ability to defend and break up rushes. But it does look like middle entries are harder to defend. And so this was a little bit interesting, and we wanted to dig a little bit further into this just because intuitively it kind of makes sense that you might be worse at defending zone entries if you're on your weak side. So then we looked at kind of shot shares and when a zone entry is conceded based on like these channels, so like the outside entry and the middle entry, what does it result when it comes to shot metrics? And so what we can see is that for strong and weak side, it does affect players' abilities to suppress shots given an entry. Shots occur at similar rates between middle and outside entries, and intuitively that kind of makes sense. Where you're defending the middle, they happen less often, but they do, in terms of correlating to shot shares, they do impact the shots that you concede. And then we wanted to look at gap distance, and this is where things kind of got interesting. So if gap distance, does gap distance affect denial rates, where are the differences seen? And so what you can see here is at the event and player level, this is where you see a big difference in gap distance. And so you couldn't really see it in the Jake Muzzin graph where we plotted all of his 2016 to 2019 zone entries. But there's a material difference in the average gap a player will concede on zone entries on their strong and weak side. We can see that at the event level, and we can see that at the player level. And it also appears that right-handed D, on average, are worse than left-handed D when it comes to defending these zone entries at the event and player level. And so I was kind of curious, can we model this? And we looked at initially like this joint plot, and it's kind of hard to see in terms of the axes, so I apologize for that, but what's plotted on the x-axis is the average gap for a given player, and then the denial rates are plotted on the y-axis. And it looks a little weird here because you would assume that as you have a bigger gap, you would actually have a lower chance of denying a zone entry. So we kind of see like this reverse effect here. And so can we, with the inclusion of handedness, strong side, weak side, and play section, can we predict zone entry? So I looked at, that's okay. So I looked at, oh, we're back. So I used a logistic regression to kind of see if we can predict the outcome if the zone entry was, the zone entry denial, which is kind of a bunch of negatives, so I apologize for that. If you're able to successfully break up the zone entry. And so what's really interesting here is that entry gap and the outside entry features are significant, where the handedness, which was encoded in this left coefficient, and the strong side coefficient were not significant. The reason why we believe this is pretty cool is that the entry gap and the outside entry, like so the strong side and the side, the strong or the side you are on and your handedness are actually probably encoded in the entry gap and the outside entry, because we've seen that through these channels on average, when you keep a player out to the outside, you tend to have a bigger gap. I didn't really explain that. So up here we can see that on the two channels we have the outside entry on the left and the middle entry on the right. So you can see that the average gap for the outside entry drastically increases on your weak side. Okay, we wanted to kind of look at expected time by side. So Tyler Della did a good job in trying to estimate what players play proportionally on their weak side using the amount of shots that they see using the XY coordinates to assume as a proxy for how much time they spend on their strong or weak side. I believe, Hayden, you kind of use the same technique or methodology for estimating time in CHL. So we kind of wanted to use the same type of approach because we can track all of the events that these players are contributing to, and so what we used is the proportion of their events split on the strong weak side axis, and to find the proportion of the time that they spend on their strong or weak side. And so as expected, you can see Nicholas Jarlison, who we saw earlier, plays the most on his weak side. Okay, this graph I'm really proud of. So how well do left-handed defensemen defend the middle on their weak side? And so what we can see here is that players vary in defending style, and that there's potential targets of players who can defend on their weak side by just kind of looking at their average zone analysis. And the reason why I chose Darth Vader in the top left-hand quadrant is because he's a Canucks prospect, Nikita Taranchin. He was deemed the next Chara. He's like 6'9", and you can see if you read the axis, the x-axis is inverted. So the higher the gap is towards the origin, and then it goes out to a lower gap. And so it looks like Taranchin is like averaging like 18 feet per entry, and he has a denial rate of like 60%. So he's kind of like using the force to like say you're not entering the zone. The bottom left-hand quadrant, you're like a pylon, right? So that's usually a big term used in hockey. The bottom right quadrant is Wile E. the Coyote, just because it's like the Roadrunner. You're like really close to him, but you can never really get to him. And then we got Gandalf in the top right corner. It's like thou shalt not pass, because you low gap and high denial rates. I spent like 2 hours making this. So how well do left-handed D defend the outside? So again, we're looking at the two ways in which zones entries are created, right? You can have a zone entry from the outside, you can have the zone entry from the inside. And what we see here is that there's a larger variance in defending the outside. And gap appears to affect denial rates as players play more on their weak side. And so if you can read the legend, which is fortunately really small as well, the shade is the proportion of that player playing on their weak side, and the size of the circles are the entries by side. So like that's how many times you would see that player defending a zone entry. And so I thought this was really, really interesting as well. Okay, so what we now know. So passing tendencies are altered by handedness. So we saw that left-hand D will predominantly go north, and that they will use the boards more, and that will affect either their passing completions percentage as well as the proportion of dump outs that they choose to make as opposed to passing. Playing on your weak side is a skill, and it can be practiced. Right? We saw Nicholas Jarmelson, who is a left-handed player, and over the course of his NHL career, he's moved more towards the right side, and he looks like a right-handed defenseman. And the third thing that we found out was that where zone entries occur and how far away they are matter more than what hand you shoot and what side you're on. However, those two are affected. So if you're on your offside, you're going to give them more gap, and therefore you're going to give them the outside entry more often. And what we want to know going forward, we want to kind of extend this now into the neutral zone and into the offensive zone. I've only been here a month, so didn't get there. We want to look at also pairing level analysis as the next step, as well as kind of maybe an expected possessions metric and maybe goals by rush type and play section. So that's it for me. Thank you, everyone. It was great to be here, and again, thanks again to the organizers. Thank you very much.
All right, and moving right along. Thank you very much, Connor. We're gonna go back to another Sport Logic fellow. So this gentleman gets his master's in management analytics from Queen's University. He also is a data analyst at Sport Logic. By the way, he's on the side, or he has, I guess, refereed minor hockey for 5 seasons. He's also coached, and he continues to play himself. His speech is called Winning Isn't Everything, a contextual analysis of hockey face-offs. Please join me in welcoming Nick Shujoy-Schulman.
Awesome. Thanks so much for having me here. I was lucky enough to present this paper at Sloan last week, but I'm really excited to get to share it with you all here today. Okay, so the paper is called Winning Isn't Everything, Contextual Analysis of Hockey Face-Offs. Quick overview of what I'll be talking about. So little intro with a video that's hopefully going to work. I'll go through the main points and the results that we found. I'll touch on one of the modeling approaches that we took, and I'll wrap up with a conclusion. Okay, so before the video starts, we're going to look at, it's an example of how not all face-offs are created equal. This is a particularly valuable face-off win, as we'll see in a minute. The background behind it is that LA was in Boston in October 2017. Score was tied at 1. They were in overtime. Boston got called with icing, and so there was going to be one last face-off with 9/10 of a second left on the clock. Because of the icing, Pasternak was stuck out for the draw, even though he's not technically a center. He had taken one other face-off that night, which he won, so 100% success rate. LA decided to pull their goalie, send out the extra attacker, and they had a decision to make in terms of who to send out for that draw. We can see they went with Kopitar, and I won't spoil what happens next. And yes, there was time remaining. So to break it down a little bit, Kopitar looks behind him, and he checks out the three directions of his teammates to where he can win the puck. As I said before, Pasternak had the one win. Kopitar was actually struggling a bit that night on the draw. So he wins it clean and in the backward inside direction towards Toffoli. And Toffoli rips it home, and they win the game. And I got to present that in Boston, which is kind of Oh, all right. How do I get to the next slide? There we go. Cool. So the problem that we identified for the project was that an average NHL game has 60 faceoffs, yet they've typically been looked at through just win percentages. And the work that's been done, either by Shuckers or some others, has not found win percentages to correlate well with anything meaningful, like, for example, goals or wins. So the goal that we had in mind was to show that not all face-off wins are created equally. And in fact, players can add value through their wins, either by winning it cleanly or in a backward direction, as it'll lead to more valuable plays for their team. We also looked at handiness and found that handiness will impact where the puck gets directed off of a face-off win. Okay, so our data set, which I'm very lucky to play around with, had over 70,000 face-offs from the 2017-18 NHL regular season, and it includes the spatiotemporal aspects of both the face-off as well as the plays that occur afterwards. So a typical data point is what you see here on the side. You have a player like Bergeron who won the draw, type of the win, it was clean. His deployment is on strong side, and then some of the aspects between the puck draw and when it ends up on his teammate's stick. So the elapsed time, the angle, the distance, as well as the direction, where the face-off took place, and who lost the draw. So to make sure that things are not a black box and that I'm explaining everything clearly, this is actually, it was more for the Sloan crowd, but I'll go through it just in case. So a face-off win gets awarded to the center of the team that earns possession of the puck first, and those wins are split up as clean and not clean. Based on a clean win is when the center earns immediate possession for himself, or on his first swing directs it directly to a teammate. Non-clean win would be the opposite of this. So there's a tie-up or a puck battle, or it's sent to an area where a teammate has to skate to recover it, and that would include a play that's won off the boards. The directions we can see over here, Connor touched on them as well. So we calculated the angles between where the puck was dropped and where it was received, and then bid them into 45-degree sectors. So if we want forward, backward, outside, which will always be towards the boards. So depending on the side of the ice that you're on, that will switch. And the inside will be the opposite of that, so towards the middle. And then the forward angle, the backward angle, so forward, outside, inside, backward, outside, inside. Deployment types, I guess Connor covered that pretty well. So strong side, weak side, lefty on the left is strong, righty on the right strong, the opposite is weak. The zones we looked at, O zone, D zone, neutral zone, we split up the north or attacking side of the red line, as well as the south and defending side of the red line. Center ice draws were mostly excluded, just because it's the furthest from the valuable area on the ice, but also there's no true outside or inside directions there, and no true strong or weak side deployments there. Yeah, so the post-face-off events that I'll be discussing are going to be broken down by zone. So in the O zone, we're looking specifically for a shot on goal or a shot attempt from the slot after face-off. In the neutral zone, it'll be an entry into the O zone, and in the D zone, it'll be an exit So a quick video just to summarize that, to make sure we're all on the same page. So here we have Stepan on his right side in the O-zone, strong side O-zone face-off. He wins it directly back and outside towards the boards to his defenseman, clean win. And as the play goes along, they end up getting a shot on net, so they get an event there. Next example, so now you have a lefty on the right side, so it's a weak side of zone face-off. And he's going to tie up his opponent, the winger comes in, picks it up. So a non-clean win, again, in the backward outside direction where he picked it up. And here they're going to set up the play, but the shot gets blocked, so they have no shot event. And the last one is now from the Ducks' perspective. So a righty on a strong side in the D zone. He's going to win it off the boards, where his teammate has to go skate to pick it up. So a non-clean win, backward outside. And the Ducks exit the zone, so they get the exit event. See if I can do this time. Cool. All right, so the first way that players are adding value through their face-off wins is by winning the face-off clean. In our data set, 44.5% of face-off wins were considered clean. And the key to these is how quick and accurately you get it to your teammate. So like we saw with Kopitar, it was onto Foley's stick in less than a second. When we break this down by zone, you can see that in the O zone and both sides of the neutral zone, we're at close to 50% for clean wins. And the big drop is really in the D zone. And this is because the defending center will want to prevent the clean win instantly, or he'll be winning it off the boards more often. See why in just a second. Yeah. So when we look at the post face-off events broken down by zone, you can see that in all four of our zones, the events occur more often off clean wins, so they're more valuable there. Again, it's because they're happening faster. You can catch your opponents off guard, run a set play off the draw, things like that. And then the biggest delta is in the O zone, 27%, between the likelihood of getting a shot on net or an attempt from the slot when it's clean compared to when it's not clean. And so this is why the defending center will really want to prevent this, because they don't want to give up that opportunity. Okay, so if we break it down at the player level, this is the bottom 10 ranked players based on their percentage of wins that were clean. We can see that Mark Jankowski is at the bottom of the list for the 2017-18 season. Some interesting things is like the fact that Austin Matthews, who had an overall win percent up near 55, which is pretty good, but he was only winning 34% of them cleanly. This is also among the only centers that took a minimum of 200 faceoffs. And there's a potential team influence here. I'd actually be curious to talk to Mike after about Calgary and if he's noticed anything with that. Because 3 of the bottom 4 players played for the Flames, and 2 of the bottom 5 played for the Leafs. So there might be some team aspect here that's going on. At the top of the list, it appears to be more skill-based. And actually, Tango Tiger had reached out and did some cool work with that, and it does appear to be skill-based. So that's kind of more supported now. And yeah, so Ryan Boyle was at the top of the list for that season, 57.3%. You can also see someone like David Perron, who Vegas trusted to take over 200 faceoffs that year. And even though his win percent wasn't that great at 41, he was winning many of them cleanly up near 55. One other thing to note is that you can see a bunch of players with faceoffs taken in like the 200 to 400 range. So these are more likely to be wingers that the team is trusting to take some draws. And so they may not be trained for things like tie-ups and all that. But when they are winning faceoffs, they're winning them quickly. One other point to make is that while overall faceoff win percentage didn't correlate well with expected goals or anything like that, we did find that the percentage of faceoffs that you win cleanly correlates much nicer with expected goals, up at 24%. So that's cool. So I hope you're not sick of the directionality charts from Connor's work, because this is where they started. Yeah, so the next way that players add value to their face-off wins is by where they're winning the puck. And just one quick point to note is that the center ice image is not the directions for the center ice draws. Those have been excluded. It's for the overall, the other 8 dots combined. So what we can see is that overall, players are winning the majority of their face-offs backward or backward to the outside. And especially in the O zone, straight back or straight back to the wall. Very few are on forward or laterally. And I guess like that makes sense because it's the furthest away from your opponents, and your defenseman can then start the play, set it up, do things like that. In the D zone, it's a little different, where the majority of draws are just one straight backward, and the backward inside and backward outside are a little more even. We can see on the D zone to the right of the net, there's a bunch more that are long to the backward left, which is likely a handedness thing that I'll talk about a bit later on. The neutral zone is similar to the O zone, where the majority are long either backward or backward to the wall. Okay, so now if we were to look within each wind direction, how often there is an event afterwards, and those events, that's the shots on net, attempts from the slot, the entries and the exits. You can see a couple changes here. So overall, again, backward and backward outside wins are highly valuable. And now we can see that backward inside wins add a bunch of value as well. So in the O zone, especially on that right side, like the Kopitar play, backward inside wins are leading to a whole bunch of shot events compared to before. And in the D zone, especially, which I thought was very surprising, backward inside wins towards your net are actually leading to the most exits. So here, I guess, teams are sending it behind the net. They can set up a breakout that way and then get the puck moving. One other thing to note is that the inside wins that are leading to exits are specifically when the puck was sent there, but your team has earned possession. So it's not looking at when you've given up the puck or chances that you might be giving up against. And these occur on average 26% slower. So the time it goes from puck drop to your teammate picking it up is slower for that inside direction when you're exiting. And so my assumption here is that the center's tying up, the inside winger is coming in, and he's getting that first touch, and then they're getting the exit off of that. Neutral zone wins are also similar to the D zone, so it's many backward inside wins that are leading to more entries. So at the player level, we have Crosby on the right and Riley Nash on the left. You can see some interesting differences. It was cool that, I think it was Jean the other day, was talking about how Crosby does really well on his face-offs, and he's helping his team score a lot with that. So cool to see that he can pull it either backward or backward outside, regardless of the side of the ice that he's on, especially in the O zone. Whereas Riley Nash appears to rely more heavily on his back, right? So Nash is right-handed, he's using that backhand a lot in terms of where he's winning the puck. Yeah, so overall, Crosby has a greater range, and Nash really just favors that back right. Okay, so handedness, as we said, is going to impact where the face-offs are directed. We can see that centers were deployed 61% on their strong sides in our example data, and they were 11% more successful when doing that. So over here we have in the bubble chart is the overall face-off win percentage on the x-axis, and the strong side utilization on the y-axis, but it's flipped. So the lower you are on the graph, the more you utilize on your strong side. So you have someone like Patrice Bergeron at the top right, who had a high overall win percentage, but was deployed less favorably and was on his weak side more often. The size of the circles corresponds to the number of face-offs that the player took. So you can see Ryan O'Reilly's massive circle from that year in Buffalo. And then the color is the delta between your strong side win percentage minus your weak side win percentage. So Kuznetsov at the top left, who was deployed less favorably, actually does much better on his strong side. Whereas below him, you have Nathan McKinnon, who was deployed more favorably on his strong side, but actually performs better on his weak side. The other thing to note at the bottom right, you have some team strategies going on. So the Flyers for that season had Giroux and Couturier take the face-off on the strong side, depending on which side the draw was on. And it paid off because both had high overall win percentages and clearly favored their strong sides. So if we break the directionality down by handiness, you can see some cool things, especially on the weak side. The strong side plot looks very similar to the overall one, and that makes sense because more centers were on the strong sides for their face-offs. So backward and backward outside most often, and backward in D-zone. But on the weak side, you get to see some cool things. So they're winning the puck backward, and they're winning it backward toward the middle. And yeah, so they can set up shots and exits and entries like that. And so before we had seen that, especially in the D-zone on the right, a lot of draws were wanting to be inside, and here's why. Yeah, so there were not many differences in the number of events that occurred between either a strong or weak side deployment. And that's just, again, because the handiness really just affects where you're sending it, and not so much. And it's where you send it that affects what happens after, but not the other way around. There was one major difference, and that was in those backward inside wins. So backward inside wins were led to more events in all four of our zones when it was a weak side deployment. So like Kopitar and a couple other examples, when he's on his weak side, he can win it directly to the middle of his backhand, and then the team can get a shot or an entry. So some of the modeling that we did, we looked at expected events, which takes the league average proportion of events that occur in each of the directions that a face-off is won, and multiplied it by the number of face-offs that a center would win in that direction. So the guys at the top of the list here are consistently winning their face-offs to higher value areas. So we can see that Jake Beagle led the season last year. Other things to note is that we could take the expected events and then compare to their team's actual events. And so we can see that Beagle and Glendenning, their teams were pretty on par with the number of events that they would have been expected to generate. But then you have guys like Vermette and Sittons and Sutter, where the teams were, even though the players were already bringing a whole bunch of value with where they were winning their draws, the teams added on top of that a whole bunch more events. So it'd be cool to look into that a bit more to see what they were up to. Okay, so in conclusion, not all face-off wins are created equally. Players are adding value through clean wins and by angling the puck in backward and backward angle directions. And so teams can start to employ handiness strategies more along these lines. And so if you have a center and he's on his weak side, they can kind of devise new plans to maximize their ability to get shots and score chances off of that. And yeah, that's it. Thanks very much.
All right, we are going to take, let's call it a 7-minute break. So everyone be back here at 10:58. 10:58.
I would love to carry. Yeah. I will. We'll tweet out all your comments with him while he's on the road.
I'll give you a hug for you. Thank you. Travel safe. Awesome. Yeah. And also,
Friday, that's All right, Josh. See you later. Have a safe trip back. Thank you. You too.
We're gonna be all like official. We didn't really even use it yesterday. Testing.
Make someone up entirely. No one will know.
Yeah. He's all grown up now. I feel like it's been enough time. I could probably post that interview. But I mean, like, why did like, I gotta be honest, like, the Panthers, like, really good.
All right.
Like, that's fair. Yeah, any team. Yeah, I'll wait. I'll wait for the you know, but if I like I think I did, and then I took running that series. The first proposing an idea, and they're like, I mean, you got a family, like it's a business. But they're my office. Yeah. Maybe I'll put that up there. What are you doing next year?
The way that it works is we push it off, the top part pops up, so then we're moving all right. Yeah.
I think I'm a man. Really nice.
Yeah.
I think it's a bag of like hot. I was thinking of ball hockey to like yeah, that's ball. I was like, coaching? Like, are you I'm like, no, like, what's exactly.
Okay, if you have everybody return to your seats, please, or you're moving. Excellent hustle, thank you so much.
Are you allowed to share your Oh, absolutely not. I was going to say.
Okay, so what we're going to do next, we're going to move into our prospect panel. This should be a good time. And this is going to take us all the way to lunch, just FYI. So, you know, get comfortable, all that good stuff. Join me in welcoming back, who we met earlier, Megan Hall. She's going to be hosting the panel. Megan, round of applause, please. And our first panelist, she's a freelance prospect writing for various publications, including The Score. She is from Georgia, but she currently resides in DC. Long live the Threshers, or not? No, okay. All right, awkward. Join me in welcoming Hannah Stewart. Our next panelist covers the Big Ten for College Hockey News. Previously, she worked for a scouting service called the Neutral Zone, and she has been covering amateur hockey for almost a decade. That is Jasmina Shaw.
Yes.
And our final panelist, contributor for The Athletic in Vancouver. He's currently the managing editor also for CanucksArmy.com. He mostly covers the Canucks and their draft prospects, but he tries to understand the CBA. That is Mr. Ryan Beach. I'll turn it over to Megan.
Awesome, thank you. Thank you guys for agreeing to be on this panel. So we did a quick introduction, but I would really like it if each of you could talk just a little bit more about what specifically drew you to working with prospects. Why you enjoy it, I mean, I assume you enjoy it, maybe you don't, we can talk about that too. And why you think that work is important in the hockey arena.
Well, I got into prospects because of spite. After the 2012-2013 lockout, I was mad at the Oilers. And so I started looking into how prospects were developed, how they were handled, and just kind of it spiraled from there. Plus the Friday Night Lights effect, that amateur level of sport, it's a draw.
I went to BU. That's pretty much all you need to know. I didn't realize when I signed my housing contract that I also sold my soul to the hockey team, so here we are. I did cover the NHL for a little bit, and I stopped because I like players at the college level because they don't have like the personality taken out of them yet, and they're very open and honest, and it's much more of a community, and it's a smaller one, and I just love being around those people. I work with the teams, the players. It's really cool getting to see them start out, because a lot of players will go to college as freshmen and they're not very developed, and then see who they become as juniors and seniors, and then getting to see them have success in the NFL is really awesome.
For me, the Canucks were bad, so that's what drew me to follow prospects. And in the sphere in Vancouver, there wasn't very many people doing it at the time. Canucks Army was starting up with it, and there was a lot of guys doing it through there, but otherwise, for the majority of the other publications, there wasn't anyone. So that's kind of why I went that way.
Since we are here at a data analyst conference, are there any particular prospect data analyst tools or resources or people that you all tend to find particularly helpful? And we don't have to go in order every time. I don't make poor Hannah go first every time. Somebody can chime in if they have an immediate response.
I'll go against because she didn't make one face. For me personally, it's the work of people who are much smarter than I. Canucks Army. Jeremy Davis has created the prospect graduation probability system, which allows us to kind of predict and guess the probability of a prospect making it and being successful. And then as well as SEAL, which is a way to kind of balance scoring based on a variety of factors, which is situation, era, age, and league, so that way you can kind of get a more balanced idea of how they can stack up against each other, because there's obviously so many leagues and juniors and pro players, and how to figure out a more accurate and balanced way to figure that out. And then there's Daryl Keeping, who's been doing a lot of manual tracking of prospects, which is zone entry, zone exits, things like that, which is added another layer recently. Those two specifically helps my analysis. And then another individual, Will Scooch, has been doing a lot of involvement percentages, trying to find out how much a prospect is involved in their points of their team when they're on the ice and off the ice. That's been a good way to kind of analyze prospects a little bit deeper.
If you want to. I can't tell.
Yeah.
Can everybody hear everyone?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, I'll just hold it, it's fine. Or I can yell either way.
Yeah, either one, your choice.
This is easier for me. I actually don't use analytics for prospects, mostly because we're still kind of in the dark ages, and the most advanced thing we have is like Corsi, which is very tough to get as it is for college hockey. Anything you need, you really have to just watch and track by hand, and there have been a few off occasions where people have tracked zone entries and things like that. Or I think at one point Brian Lambert did adjusted save percentage, which is the thing that I want the most because our goalie stats are horrific. But we don't really have them. So for us, it's kind of just I know people hate the eye test, but that's what we do. It's like listening to the same song over and over again on the radio. You wake up one day and you realize you know all the words. If you just watch enough, you have a pretty good feeling of whether, how players are doing and whether they're really factoring in, if they're not factoring into the score, and why is that. So it's just not really something that we have available and not something that I do.
I'm kind of in between the two. I've found tools that I like, and they're good, but we're missing so much information when it comes to prospects. I just want time on ice. Someone give me time on ice, and I'll figure things out from there.
Just to add to that, there's also huge discrepancies in the data provided.
Yes.
You'll watch a game and a prospect or a player will do something and, check the score sheet afterwards, so the player's not there or has been listed as a secondary assist when watching the game was a primary assist. So those discrepancies kind of make it that, you still do have to watch the games.
Yeah, in terms of these advancements that you guys would ideally like to see in this field of prospect analysis, I know you mentioned time on ice. Is there anything that like really specifically sticks out besides that? And as you mentioned, of course, having better data quality is always important. But if there's something specific you guys are often like, oh my God, I wish somebody had this.
Just accurate representation of shots would be great. Accurate anything.
Accurate anything.
I want accuracy.
Accuracy, that's a good.
Because it's so different between leagues and between even teams. And so you have some information to work with and you take it with a grain of salt in some places. Some places you get a feel are more reliable than others. You just have to work off what you have. I feel like I'm stumbling around in the dark a lot of the time.
We're going to talk a lot, obviously, about the eye test versus data here. But before we get into kind of that big picture thing, are there any like specific players that you personally have had experiences with where either the eye test was showing something that the data wasn't, or vice versa, or in any cases where eye test or data has really changed your perception of a player?
I've been dying to share this anecdote, and I've been talking about it all morning, so I have to do it. In 2016, two of the Hobie Baker finalists, one of them was Jimmy Vesey and the other one was Kyle Connor. So we just looked at goals and points, but even if you looked at advanced statistics, they would probably tell you that Kyle Connor's numbers were better than Jimmy Vesey's. A lot of people thought Kyle Connor should win Hobie Baker. There was a vocal minority, myself included, that thought Jimmy Vesey should win Hobie Baker, but assumed it would go to Kyle Connor. So we were all surprised when Kyle Connor didn't win. So the problem with looking at that is people just looked at Connor's stats and they just looked at Vesey's stats, but they didn't take into account who they were playing against. And this is the biggest problem I think we have with prospect data, is just that it's such a huge variety of leagues and teams and who you're playing against and the age of the players and the ability of those. So if you're looking at Kyle Connor was playing in the Big Ten where they had absolutely no goaltending and optional defense. So obviously it's going to score a lot of goals. Jimmy Vesey was playing in the ECAC, which at the time had very strong defense and some of the best goaltending in the country. And, along with that, like, he plays for an Ivy team, so if you're looking at just points versus points, he's not playing as many games as Kyle Connor. So those of us who followed the ECAC, and I did both because I was still covering Princeton at the time while covering the Big Ten, a lot of us knew that Vesey's the better player. And that's not even really something you need to watch to see, you just need to have that context. But even if you watch, like, you can kind of tell, like, to me it's not surprising. I think Vesey's a better player than Connor, but even if you weren't watching them play and you just took a little bit more context and really just like looked at the stats of the league, you'd be able to tell that. But that's probably like the biggest issue I've ever seen in terms of like, if you just look at the statistics, advanced or not, it's not going to tell you the whole story, especially with prospects.
It makes me think of the Q in the CHL, because people who aren't super involved tend to overrate players from the Q because point totals are so high because defense optional. But then those of us who know that tend to maybe underrate some of those players. Like for me, it was Dubois that the Blue Jackets drafted. I was skeptical of his numbers because he is in the Q, and I was like, maybe is that not such a good choice? And then he proved me wrong. He's one that I've been wrong on.
Yeah, I think quality of teammates and quality competition is important. You look at someone like Peyton Krebs and this year, he's awful, but he's out there doing pretty much everything for them. And then you can see these guys getting, falling lower and lower in draft rankings. And I'm not saying it's not justified right now, but I'm saying that, why is he getting, brought down lower, because his team is so bad and he's doing everything for them. And then you look at someone like Brett Leeson, maybe with the Princeton Raiders, and the Raiders are a really good team. And yes, he's driving a lot of their offense, but you kind of see his stock rising, and they're pointing and saying he's doing all the success when he has a little bit more, quality with him. And kind of look back to the original question is that, there's players, and the player that I always go back to is Lucas Elving with the Vegas prospect. There was a lot of, really positive data for him in terms of zone entries and gaining his zone with the puck. But you watched him and he was fairly timid in his draft year. In the second initial draft, plus 1 year, he was a lot more aggressive, and you still saw those strong numbers, and then his numbers were reflected from it. So that's kind of one of those things that the data didn't support what the eye test was because you didn't see him creating plays, but he's still doing the good things. And once he got more aggressive and willing to do, take it up into the zone to make a hit, or sorry, take a hit or something like that, then, he took an even bigger step forward, and now he's probably one of their better prospects as they trade everyone else away.
Yeah, I was bringing up earlier, Gustav with the London Knights. He's behind so many good players, but if you look, 23 of his 30 points are primary points. And so that's a guy you're going to want to keep an eye on. So I guess context is everything.
On that note, in college hockey, like sometimes you'll see kids come in as freshmen and score a lot and not score as much later on. But the more they're there, there's a lot more emphasis on their 200-foot game and their defensive play, because at that point they realize they're not going to make the NHL unless they play better defensively. And sometimes you really see their points and their offensive production take a hit, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're worse players. Like if you look at Ohio State right now, they had some of the highest scoring players in the country, but like 2 of their top players, Mason Yass and Tanner Lazinski. I mean, Lazinski was also hurt, he wasn't playing for a little bit, but their numbers are not the same as it was before, and that's because the team is very much focused on defense now, which is why they're winning. But it doesn't mean that they've gotten worse or that they're still not, like Tanner Lazinski's not a good prospect. It's just their focuses have shifted because you need to have some sort of defensive element to succeed at the next level.
A couple of you brought up players like this, so I kind of want to dive into this a little bit. Do any of you guys have specific prospects that kind of stick in your mind that you were either really wrong about or really right about, and feel free to brag about players that you were right about and everyone else was wrong about? Especially if you can pinpoint like why you think either your initial perception was off or other people's perception was off.
I brought up Dubois as one that I was wrong about. That was my anti-Q bias playing in there. But in terms of right about, Alex DeBrincat is the primary example because he was small and people said he'll never make it in the NHL. Fast forward 2-3 years and look at it now, it's absurd. And so I like to say, Cole Caulfield on the NTDP right now is a guy we're going to be talking about like that in a few years. I have a lot of students.
For me, I'm going to get in a lot of trouble for saying these, but 2 of the goalies I covered were Mike Condon when he was at Princeton and Matt O'Connor when he was at BU. So I think I hold the title of being the only person who's had 2 goalies they've covered make their NHL debuts against each other, because I don't think that's happened before. But Mike Condon was someone who, if you looked at his numbers and you watched him play, you never would have thought he'd make the NHL. And I'm not the only person that felt that way. Like everyone at Princeton really felt that way. So like that's something I guess we were all wrong on. But I just feel like with goalies, there's kind of like a really big miss between how good a goalie actually is versus whether people, I don't know, it's very weird. I'm just going to stop talking about that. But the other one was Matt O'Connor, who I love with all my heart. But I got in a lot of trouble because when he was a free agent, there was a lot of hype surrounding where he would sign. And I was one of the people in college hockey, there were several of us that were like, you are all insanely crazy because he's not an NHL caliber goalie. And I think the reason people thought he was is because he had a very good season that year. That year BU made this year does not exist in my life anymore. But in 2015, I will not talk further about this. He had good numbers and he was obviously helping them win until it really mattered and then he could not help them win. But that's the story. So people were looking at his numbers, but I think a lot of the people who actually watched him play and were familiar with BU and kind of Hockey East in general had a very good knowledge of the fact that like he wasn't going to make the NHL. And I mean, he did obviously play in a couple of games, but he's not an NHL caliber goalie. He's still good. So like that's one of the ones where I think like, again, like I said before, if you watch enough, you just generally have a good feeling of whether someone or not will make the NHL. Sometimes you're wrong. We were wrong with Mike Condon, but also like with goalies, it's kind of hard to tell because I think that, I know Hannah and I were talking about like size. Even if size is not like an actual factor that will make a goalie good, that's what GMs are looking for right now. So even if you have a specific model or like a specific data that tells you this goalie will be good, if that goalie doesn't have what the GMs are specifically looking for until we find a way to bridge that gap, it's not going to matter because they're just really not going to get that chance. I look at goalies and I think if they're a certain size or they play a certain way, they're not going to make the NHL. And usually, most times, you're correct about that.
So it's not so much whether they should, but whether they will.
Yeah, goalies are always hard to predict. I know that for O'Connor specifically, same thing is that I thought he was going to be an excellent goalie. And then speaking with people who kind of follow it better and better at goalie analysis, they said that basically his entire game had to be broken down quickly in order for him to even have a chance to be a professional goalie. And that was going to have to be, we're talking 6-7 months in the first half of the year. And if he wasn't going to do that, then his career was going to be shot as a professional goalie, and that's pretty much what happened, right? For me personally, one player that I was very wrong about was Hunter Shukarik, who at the time was a Canucks prospect. I saw him in the Dub live a few times. He was an electrifying player at the Dub level. He played pretty well at the AHL level. Canucks traded him, and along with many people like myself, we were pretty upset about that just because he kind of gave an element that the organization lacked. And he's fizzled out since then. And the main reason why is because the offense he was generating in the AHL just wasn't going to make it to the NHL, and injuries. So for something like that, what you try to do is going forward is how to apply that to other players in future years, and looking for players and how they're generating their offense in junior, how they're generating offense in the AHL, and how much those injuries can affect the player's development and derail it very quickly, and how can you apply that going forward, right? So that's kind of everyone makes mistakes in their analysis, and it's always going to be opinions, especially with what we do, but how do you make yourself better next time and not make those same mistakes?
Yeah, and hopefully speaking of not making the same mistakes, you mentioned Alex Brinkett, you were mentioning the size of goalies. In one of the talks we had yesterday, they were talking about how size, height, and weight in players is not really a significant predictor of future talent. Do you think that in the work that you've done, do you think people's minds are changing? Thankfully, we now have the Brinkett to point to as evidence for that. Do you think people are making progress in ignoring size of prospects, or no?
I think so. I think that the NHL is always a copycat league. You see teams copy, the Stanley Cup winner and kind of see a trend and then go from there. And I think that draft prospects is fairly similar. There's always going to be a bias for, to larger players in the past, but we've seen now with the NHL getting faster that they try to get away from that. And, success stories like the Brinkett has led to players like Yamamoto being drafted early. Cofield's going to be drafted early. Teams are going to be more willing to take that risk and put these players in situations. And that's going to, obviously affect trends going forward. I mentioned the prospect, probability system. Obviously there's going to be a bias more towards larger players because it's, looking at history. And that's part of, how you analyze that. And you look at someone like Cofield and say, you know what, he probably doesn't have a really high success rate from his cohorts, but the things he does and the way the NHL is now, there's going to be a much higher probability of success. So, he is a first round player, or, wherever he's going to go, rather than be someone who might be a late round player like a Johnny Gaudreau kind of thing, right?
Yeah, we're making progress, but it's slow.
I think we're making progress except for goalies. I still maintain if teams see goalies and they're not a certain size, if they're not tall enough, people look at goalies and they're like, oh, that person's really tall, they're gonna be like an NHL.
They see a 6'7" guy and they're like, oh, he's gonna fill up the whole net.
But it doesn't, again, it doesn't matter if they should, it's a matter of what these people see, how are you gonna change their bias towards that? But I do agree, I think with skaters, it's getting a little bit better, but I also feel like those players still have to be exceptionally better than their teams.
Ryan has more faith in GMs than you. I'm highly pessimistic on that level, but I do think we are moving in the right direction.
We mentioned Cole Caulfield, you mentioned Krebs earlier. Do you guys have any other particular favorite prospects that are in this 2018 draft?
Yes. Alex Turcotte. He started out the season very injured, missed a lot of the season. I think he's played, the NTDP plays versus college teams and the USHL teams. So he hasn't played as much as his teammates, but his numbers are absurd. I love him. I have this notebook that I use for all my scouting notes, and on the first few pages from this season, there are just notes in the margins everywhere about pay attention to Alex Turcotte when he comes back. And he's proven me right on that. and he's gonna be really good.
Fun fact, earlier this year, I was in a bathroom line behind his mother, actually, and she was talking to another mother, I didn't know whose mom she was, and she said his attitude, because the other mother was asking how he was doing with his injury, and she said his attitude was really good, so we have that. You can add that to your qualitative analysis.
Part of our prospect research, right? I have a couple of them that I call Pam, Joel Fairby's mom and David Ferentz's mom, and they're the best.
They're like,
not useful
what,
analysis.
yeah, I think a little bit past that usually, by the time they get to the course, they're already.
She's like one of mine. The other one I like is Alvin Greyway, a Swedish prospect. He's kind of a little bit of a wrecking ball up there, but has some really good skill. I always seem to have a bias towards Swedish and Finnish players more recently because I really like the way that both programs kind of play the game and the way their system is with their junior league and getting chances in the Allsvenskan and Liga and SHL. I really like how they, develop players. And, if a player is playing in the men league in their draft year, that's always a good sign. Usually leads to high success rates. So even just getting a cup of coffee in their draft season is always an encouraging sign. And he's one who has, and I like the way he plays. I like chaos hockey sometimes. Save chaos, obviously. We don't want the bad hits, but kids who are willing to get in on forecheck that still have that skill. That's the kind of guys I like to follow.
Yeah, another guy for me is Robert Mastrosimone from the Chicago Steel. I feel like he's not getting enough attention because he's one of the American players who's outside of the program. But his primary point totals are fantastic, and when you watch him, he's just relentless. And so he's one that I would keep an eye on.
The program is kind of ridiculous too.
It's absurd, and I could very accurately be accused of having an NTDP bias, but this year they're proving me right.
Yeah, I will not be surprised if 90% of that program is drafted. It's insane.
It's ridiculous. This 2001 group is just, they went so long without losing at the international level, and now they're approaching their draft, and they've lost several times, which I found hilarious.
Not enough to compete.
Yes. They're slacking.
Yeah.
So when you are evaluating prospects, and we can talk about if you have different approaches for whether you're looking at either draft eligible prospects or prospects in the AHL or prospects in college, is to what are a few, just to distill it down to a few things, either qualitative or quantitative, that you look for at specific levels.
Primary points.
In terms of quantitative, that's what you look at most?
Yeah, I think that the ability to create and drive offense for their team is important. Situational is important as well. I think someone like Morgan Frost was a victim of being on a really strong team with the Sioux and went in his draft year. He was kind of a third liner, if I recall correctly. And there was kind of some eyebrows raised at the time when Philly took him in the first round. But we've obviously seen him taken off from here. He's done really well. Yeah, those are the kind of two that you look for. Obviously, luck plays into it too as well. You want to see players, creating that offense. The point totals might not always be there, but if they're creating offense and creating chances and making things happen more regularly than not, that's usually the first thing done.
Unless quantitatively, just so much of scouting is going with your gut, and it sounds so stupid, but when you get used to these leagues, you watch players, and if somebody stands out to you, there's a reason. When you've watched so much of it, and so you dig deeper into that player.
Yeah, I agree. It's hard to pick a few points because usually you just know.
Yeah.
And
that's so hard to qualify.
Yeah. I'd say probably the biggest thing I would say is the speed. Players at the college level especially, there are some players that you can tell will not be NHL prospects because they don't have fast enough hands and they can't skate fast enough, and that's pretty much a dead giveaway. So I'd say that's probably the biggest thing. But other than that, I don't know.
And speed is not just foot speed, it's do they think the game at a level that matches their skating.
So that's a really big thing. Usually if players have high hockey IQ or they think quickly or they've adjusted really well as freshmen. I think Luke Cunnin was one of those players that was he can think the game really fast. Well. That speed in those aspects is probably what I would say is a really good predictor for whether or not they'll be good at NHL.
There's been a lot of talk in baseball recently, and we talk a lot about how baseball tends to be so far ahead of hockey in terms of analysis, of course, very different game, about how they're starting to really phase out traditional scouting more in favor of like pure data analysis. And I'm guessing I can guess probably your answer to this question, but do you think that the same thing is happening in hockey?
We were talking about this on our walk over here, and we were like, we're gonna make a lot of people mad, but the eye test is so important with prospects. And obviously nobody in this room is gonna argue don't watch video, but.
Like ultimately, analytics are great, but it's the kind of thing where like, so I like we mentioned in my bio, like I used to work in neutral zone. So basically what they would do is they have like a bunch of scouts who prepare like scouting reports on a bunch of players. So for college coaches, it's really tough for them to like get out to all like, there are so many games, there's so many players to watch, it's really difficult. So, but they don't like only rely on the scouting reports. It's usually like, I see a player play multiple times, I have an interest in them, let me see what you have. And is that the same thing as what I have? And if not, like, what am I missing? Like, where is the gap? So it would kind of be the same thing with analytics if we ever get to that point where we like have enough like accurate data. Like I know like we were talking about the whole thing, like people fudge the weight and stuff like that all the time, and like the height. So like half of what you're getting probably isn't really accurate anyway.
The guy's height is probably 2 to 3 inches off.
Yeah. Like
no prospects are 5'11". If you see 5'11" on the sheet, that means they're like 5'9".
The ones on if they're really tall ones, like if they're listed as 6'7" or 6'8", they probably are.
Yeah. No, I'm not going to be different from their answer, but I don't think that we're going to get away from it entirely. I think that one of the most important skills when it comes to prospects and scouts that I think gets underrated is the ability to interview these players and get to know these players and understand what ticks, and that talking to coaches and talking to agents and talking to all these people and collecting information from that sense. And obviously people like ourselves, I'm sure Jazz has more time to speak to the players, but myself, that's probably the biggest gap I have, is that I don't know player X personally. I don't know what drives him. I don't know what his family is going through to get on here, and that's going to drive him to be better. I think that the biggest change that we've started to see and will continue to see is that we'll get scouts that are willing to apply that information, their eye test information and analytics, and be willing to then go back and use the analytics to confirm what they've seen, challenge their biases, challenge what they see, how things are happening. And I think that's the biggest growth that will be, because I think no matter what with hockey, there's so many things happening on the ice at so many times. It's so quick reactionary that you can't just go by video. You have to see viewings, you have to focus in on a player and see how their anticipation is off the screen and what they're doing, throughout the entire game. And I know that watching any feeds that, OHL, USHL, the feeds are not perfect. You'll miss 10, 15 seconds of a play because it's a jumbotron screen. And, that can be important things that have happened before a play. And you just see that, player X is out of position, but you don't know why. And so I think that no matter what, it has to be, the traditional scout. It's just going to be an evolution of how they do things.
Yeah, going back to the watching players, like Hannah and I were talking about, ideally seeing them live is the best thing to do and the best way to scout a player. It's not always realistic. And just analytics are great, but I think for a lot of people it's just easier, because if you've been scouting is very difficult, but if you've been doing it for a while and you know what you're doing, on maybe 3, watching a player a few times, you get a very good idea of and depending on who they're playing against, you have a pretty good idea of whether or not this is a player you want to take in or not. Whereas if you're trying to do an analytics thing and you're starting from scratch, for us, I feel like it just takes 2 more time. It's just easier for us to watch it and then to get a feel of whether or not this player would make it.
Yeah, I'm an obsessive researcher, and so I'll start a video, but then I'll go look at the numbers, and then I'll look at what is someone else saying about this player. Are they seeing something that I'm missing? Are they confirming, positive or negative things that I'm seeing, or am I completely off base? So I just want more information always.
Yeah, self-checking is a very important skill, especially in the public sphere as well, because there are quite a few people who do similar things to us, and they, it's always good to get their opinions and see what they say, and then kind of self-check from there. The thing that I find with analytics is it's really hard at the top of the NHL draft to differentiate these players. Player one is generally, player one, but if we're talking player 5 to 10, there's not going to be a large difference between those two. And that's where, a lot more of an eye test may apply, but where you can use the analytics to apply is those later round players and trying to extract value from those later round picks. So that's a lot more where your biases will cloud your judgment. We all have players that we like watching. We all have players that, we go watch them 5, 6, 7 times, and every time we're like, oh, this player's the best. And then you look at your numbers, you're like, okay, maybe he's not going to make it. You just have to understand that maybe, you're excited because he's doing things you enjoy, but his probability is just not going to make it.
Yeah, the hard thing to learn is just because you like a player doesn't mean he's good.
Yeah.
And so you have to be able to differentiate between the two. Like, I have players that I like who are going to be career AHLers. That doesn't mean it's not valid to like watching them play, but yeah. I love
that, but it's true.
I love watching Miles Poulos, but he's never going to make the NHL. He's going to be in the AHL the rest of his career.
So we've talked about kind of the limitations of the data we have available and the importance of the eye test, but are there any other particular things that you really wish more people knew or understood about assessing and evaluating prospects?
The thing for me, like I mentioned before, is you have to really understand what league the prospect is playing in and what that entails. Like I know I talked about these days versus Big Ten. In college hockey, every conference is a different strength. Some are just bad, some are good, some are really good defensively, some have really terrible defenses. The Q, you're gonna score a lot of points, and you really have to understand, data without context is really just a bunch of numbers that mean absolutely nothing. So you have to, the biggest thing for me is people are always, sometimes they're comparing kids in major junior to college hockey and they're looking at the numbers and it's you cannot do that because if this kid's 18 years old and he's playing college hockey, he's playing against kids that are 24 years old and guess what? They spend a lot of their time in the weight room and crap like that. So they're big physical. It's just very different. You cannot just compare numbers to numbers and expect saying that person is better numbers, they're a better player. That's
apples and oranges, it's like apples and dolphins.
Yeah.
I think that for ourselves in the public sphere, I think that there's the expectation that we know a lot more about all these different players across various leagues, and have be experts on those things. And I think that, there's only so many hours and so many minutes in a day. You can only watch so much video and analyze so much data, where generally with NHL organizations, you do have, the crossover scouts who will be kind of playing that role, but there's a lot of regional scouts who, they may not know about a Swedish player because they're the OHL scout. And so it comes down to people's opinions, people's biases. As I mentioned, I have my own bias and I'm willing to say that I do. And that's kind of how we drive the information. And as Jeff said, the stats are very important as well. You can't compare between the two. It's so different from each league. And the Q has a perception of being, defense league. Well, actually, he's been, more goals recently, and there's still that perception that the Q is the high-end offensive league, and the Dub is always this gritty league that,
tough defense.
Yeah, you're getting a good prairie boy to be your third pairing defenseman, where there are still a lot of skilled players coming out of those leagues, right?
One thing, I'm not sure how to what category this falls under, but something that I wish people knew about prospects is when you're watching a player and someone says, oh, his compete level's not high enough, he's not skating hard enough, he's not working hard enough. There's this perception that if it looks like a guy's floating around the ice, then he's lazy. He's just a good skater. If you see a guy and he's pumping his legs and he's working real hard to get off the ice, that's bad. You don't want that. And that's not something that I feel like a lot of people realize or internalize. So, stuff like that.
All right, well, we would like to open the floor to questions from the audience. If you have a question for a specific person or for the panel in general, let's hear it.
So for the panel, how do you differentiate between, so no metric is going to be 100% predictive, right? So people are going to squeak through, or 0% predictive. So there's some metric that may or may not be predictive, and how do you differentiate between somebody who's kind of an outlier, an exception, versus identifying a scouting inefficiency? So, for example, back, maybe 10, 15 years ago, when smaller players started to, make the NHL more, well, that was a scouting inefficiency. But maybe You know, somebody who you know, like Theo Fleury, right? I mean, you know, 5'3", 120-pound players. Those guys aren't making the NHL, right? So he's an outlier. Like how, because you don't have the data to match. So it's just like a process question. How do you differentiate between outlier versus scouting inefficiency? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
Scouting inefficiency so much as it is changing the minds of the people at the top and what kind of league that you want. The reason they would assume, like in the past, that you can't have smaller players is because it was much more physical and like bigger players, and we're just gonna hit everybody. And now we're transitioning to scoring and speed. So I think it's a lot more about having those people decide the kind of identities, and like hockey's a dinosaur, so it's just gonna move really slowly. But it's more about changing the minds of the people at the top and like what they want, if that makes sense. I think being more open-minded.
Yeah, I think a lot of it has to do with environmental as well, or situational. You know, there are teams who are better at developing prospects than others. So, you know, player X might have been drafted by the Vancouver Canucks and their development system isn't very good, so he's not going to make the NHL, but if he goes to Tampa Bay with the next pick, then they're going to extract some value out of it. So it can definitely be hard in that sense, and as they go kind of look through the trends of the league and the subjective biases, definitely a huge part of that.
Actually, it reminds me of something before we move on. You said, what do we want more people to know about prospect evaluation? So much happens after a guy is drafted. There are so many variables that come into play there. What development environment are they in? Are they in major junior? Are they in college? Are they playing, you know, overseas? And then who drafted them? Does that team have a good development structure? Because we know some teams don't. Some teams are very bad at developing players. And so there are just so many factors that come into play after a draft. And you know that saying, like, you can only accurately evaluate a trade the day it happens. I'm almost tempted to say do that with the draft too, because there's just so much that we haven't dug into and quantified after the draft yet.
You can't like look at a player and say, oh, this player's bad and messed up. Like Adam Larson's the one who's the most, like, I guess he's okay now, but like I think he had a much better future, and I think that was just really messed up.
Did you mess up on draft day, or did you mess up when you developed
They
it?
messed up, yeah. It's one of those things. Like it's not that he was a bad pick, it's just that they completely messed up how they developed it. And then yeah, you have to look at like teams. If they have kids in college, are they pulling them out, or are they doing, you know, like it's really
Yeah, I think that my biggest, I don't want to say cringe, but biggest frustration I see is when there's automatically grades placed on drafts or draft classes in the following days after the draft. I don't have an issue with there being some sort of data that be, you know, saying that there's going to be, you know, X probability that they're going to extract one player or two players based on this, but to be like, you know, team A had a B+ rating because they got this player here. There's so many variables, and as Hannah said, there's so many different things that play into it in draft +1, draft +2, draft +3. We've seen so many prospects that, you know, they look like they're going to be a surefire star, and they just fall off the map because of injuries and or their system that they're working in. And we've seen players who buck the trend, and that could be because, you know, they're a really driven kid who, you know, wants to prove the world wrong, or they understand and listen to everything that they've been told by the organization and it's worth the success.
I mean, you could hypothetically imagine if team A drafts a class and team B drafts a class, and you just switch those classes, you could get totally different NHL players or not, just based on the development. I think there's a question over here. Yep.
Or, you mentioned that once players get drafted, they might work on like other aspects of their development, like defensive. For players that don't get drafted, are they still focused on more like primary visual parts of their game so that they might potentially get signed, or are they also working on those other levels?
I was going to say the one thing that I was told by a scout was that if you're good, you're going to be found eventually. And so, you know, I think that those players that you might be talking about, I don't know specifically what they do, but I think that it's still a fairly similar evolution process. There might be more emphasis on, you know, being more aggressive and creating offense, but I think that they understand that, you know, they still have to be a full, complete player, help their team win, and then the good things will come after that. It sounds cliche, but that does, you know, that is something that definitely does happen.
Yeah, the real difference is like your development's not being guided by your NHL organization, but it's being guided by the team that you're on right now. And so it's still, useful, and if you're good, people are gonna see it.
For college hockey, a lot of it is players who usually are not drafted are a lot smaller and they're just not physically developed. So usually in college hockey, all players work on getting stronger and faster and physically getting larger. So for college players that usually are undrafted free agents and then get signed, that's probably the biggest thing I've seen. It's just, they really work on getting stronger.
Joel Farabee, he was drafted, but didn't he put on 10, 15 pounds between last year and this year?
I think that's one of the things that gets overvalued or misconstrued on draft day is a prospect size. I know myself at 18 years old, I was maybe 140 pounds. They're still kids, they're still gonna change. I remember seeing a specific quote that saying if Elias Pettersson was 15 pounds heavier or 20 pounds heavier, he would have gone first overall. And that's just ridiculous.
That's something you can change too. It's
Yeah.
not like it's a permanent thing. You can't change how fast, maybe you can, but it's harder to change how quickly you think the game is to change how quickly.
Yeah, and that's this year's NTDP class, for example. There's not a whole lot of heavy guys on that team. Some of them are taller than others, but they're not, 200-pound guys or more.
And I think it's extremely important that the players put on their weight correctly during those 18, 19, 20-year-old ages, because if you try to add too much muscle strength to your top half, you might struggle with your skating, which might have been what your attribute was, or vice versa, or you might just be really weak on the top. So I think that it's a huge discrepancy and something that can be improved is understanding that they are still kids. They still have 2, 3, 4 years to go before they might even get a sniff at the NHL level, aside from obviously the handful of top prospects.
Yep.
This question's for Ryan specifically. I was just wondering if you might have any insider info on video game addictions affecting.
No, it's a big thing, obviously. Yeah. No insider information.
Yeah.
How much do you value major tournaments like NCAA, World Juniors, Memorial Cup, and see that value of seeing players in context versus a minuscule sample size?
It's another context to see them in, which is great. It's always great to see them in a different situation, but there's so much recency bias that comes after something like World Juniors or the Frozen Four, and it's just not useful.
I don't value that stuff at all. As much as I think Don Lucia should have been fired by Minnesota, he made a great comment that Gophers won a lot of regular season championships, not as many Big Ten tournaments. And he was like, granted, one will get you into the NCAA tournament, but the regular season championship actually shows how you've done over the course of the season. And to win the NCAA tournament, all you need to do is get hot at the right time. Honestly, the reason Michigan not making the NCAA tournament this year is not a surprise. The only reason they got as far as they did last year is because Hayden Levine magically out of nowhere just became one of the best goalies in the country, and he was able to pull them through, but he's not a good goalie. And it showed again, it showed in the first half of last season, and it showed again this year. So honestly, I don't really take any of those.
I like World Juniors because it lets me see players with different teammates. That's about as far as it goes for me.
I have a lot of thoughts on this. The tournaments get overvalued, without a doubt. I'll use an example of this year is Philip Broberg was really good at pulling Craig Gretzky in the summer. He was, showing some fantastic skating abilities, showing his size, scoring some highlight reel goals, but he was taking advantage of some pretty weak defensemen in that tournament. And then if you look at his play in the Allsvenskan, he's not able to do those things. He's not able to do that in professional hockey. I don't have the data in front of me, obviously, but from what I recall looking at it is that his success rate based on his point total is extremely low. His zone entries are okay. His zone exits are okay, but I'm still seeing him ranked as a top 5 prospect by some people because he was so electrifying in that tournament that people, immediately assume that he's doing the same thing otherwise. For me personally, I use the tournaments as benchmarks to get growth on players. Obviously Helmika is a really good event because it's draft prospects. U18 is because it's all draft prospects, and you can kind of see the evolution of player X from August until I guess his name. I can't April. That's how I use those tournaments, but I don't overvalue the play, because there's so much situational, so much, deployment with it. There's so many variables, as we've seen, a game can flip in a matter of minutes at the World Juniors, and that can change your perception. So that's really how I use those tournaments, and then it's just added to kind of the pile of the play.
For me, international tournaments are also more about how is the country's overall program doing, how is their development program looking, and not so much the individual players.
I take much more value in club play than the tournaments. How they do, even in a handful of games of SHL play, compared to representing Sweden at the World Juniors, is more important. With that being said, being a 17-year-old on the Swedish junior team is an encouraging sign, and again, it just gets put in the pot.
Just enjoy the tournament, and if your favorite prospect is terrible, don't worry. It's fine. It happens.
So I have a quick follow-up. I get the idea of trying to evaluate them on a bigger, scale as opposed to just the tournaments. Do you think there's any value on the stage that's associated with those bigger tournaments though? Like if a guy can, I get a cringe. Like if a guy can perform really well in a tournament like that, does that have any value towards translating to a higher level, do you think?
I think being clutch or being, stepping up into the stage is important to some degree. You do want to have players that want to embrace that challenge. You want to have players that want to, be the guy. But you also want to have, players that understand that they might not be the guy and then accept the role that they're going to be given. So I think that kind of loops back to what I said about the scouting and interviews and that assessment that plays into it. And I'm sure that the, professional scouts have more information on that. But yeah, that's absolutely part of it for sure. I'm not going to, put stock in him missing the net with 1 minute left and then down a goal, but his overall play in that sequence would be something that I would definitely keep tabs on.
Yeah, it's valuable, but it tends to be overrated, and I value buy-in more from a player.
I think for me, I just look at it like either way, whether a player came up clutch or they didn't, is like, I know people are gonna hate me for saying this, but like the adversity thing. Because for players, like it is important, you can polarize if you want, that they know how to handle that stuff and how to deal with it, because like it's just, I was talking to like a player the other day who got stuck at a junior team he didn't want to be on, and there was no other, like he just had to be there and he hated it and he did very badly. But you go through things like that, like you learn how to stick it out. So it gives you a little bit more of an advantage going forward, because like life's really shitty and it's gonna happen. And like if you've dealt with it before, like most likely you'll be okay, and like you'll be able to keep working at it and like keep pushing at it. And like I know that sounds like kind of one of those like weird gritty things, but like it like matters.
No, it's tenacity. That's not something you can overvalue, I think, if you know how to put it in the proper context. Yep.
Yeah, this is a question for all three. Ryan brought up earlier about your Canuck prospect that one part of the reason why it didn't work out was maybe injuries. And while maybe someone here has already done research on kind of the repeatability of injuries, I'm sure Ryan, the agent from yesterday, is talking about it, heard scouts say like, oh, he gets injured a lot, or he got hurt and we kind of want to shy off. Have you guys seen anything with whether a player gets injured and having that injury come back often, or like if a player is often injured, then that kind of is a sign that going forward that's going to be repeatable?
Yeah, I think Tommy Cross's career was kind of doomed by his repeated knee injuries. And I think before he left college, that was a pretty good sign. Like he's a good player, but I think everyone knew he wasn't going to make it to the next level, and that he's not ever going to be an NHL player now. Because it was one of those things where it kept coming back. And I think it depends on what kind of injury though. Like, Will Lockwood's gotten injured all the time. Like, one time he broke his wrist, the other time he popped out his shoulder. So like, I don't think that's something that's going to be repeated, but if it's like a knee or an ACL type thing, like then it gets a little bit, like if it happens once, I think okay, but like, if it happens a few more times, like it kind of does, it's like a very dicey area.
A player I like to go back to for this is Bo Bennett. He's one of the smartest players I've ever encountered. He does the little things so well, but he has been plagued by ligament-based injuries, and that has screwed certain parts of his game and makes teams less willing to take a chance or less willing to play him when he is on their team. And so it's frustrating but understandable. I guess, sort of. I'm not, it's, like you said, it's dicey.
Yeah, it's hard to say, because like on one hand, you like, maybe they should get a chance, but also do you really like the player is gonna be in so much pain later on in their lives if they keep going through this, so it's just like a very odd area, but teams are definitely less willing to take a chance on players who like have repeated injuries. So usually players leaving college, like this is kind of a big thing. But I think, like you said, the ligament-based injuries are one of that are really tough.
Yeah, I think that you can actually take, use your eye test for that. Is he doing things that are putting him in positions where he's going to be compromised, or is it just shitty luck? And another part is moving back to Henderson Carrick. He had hip surgery. What really set him apart was his ability to skate, and he just couldn't skate the same way. And so that's another way that can derail a player. So it's tough. I'll never admit that I know anything about, medicine or anything like that, but that's kind of how I use those things with hockey.
Yeah, since I had hip surgery, the same one that a lot of hockey players have, the labral repair. And since I had that surgery, I've got a new perspective on just how much that can affect your skating, and it really does. And so, if you have that surgery and you don't recover properly, you don't come back through the right physio plan, and you weren't a great skater to begin with, then, that's gonna knock you out.
Yeah. So, to kind of words in your mouth, if you can be devalued with repeated injuries that kind of plague you throughout growing up and playing professionally, is there value in seeing a player who did get injured, took the time to recover properly, and then came back and grow from that?
I don't really. I mean, I like it kind of goes back to the adversity thing. Like if a player can stick it out, but I honestly don't really think it makes much of a difference.
I think kind of tangentially to that, a team could maybe get a player who gets injured in his draft year and who might be undervalued by everyone else, but is good and just wasn't seen as much. But otherwise, I don't think.
I think Turcotte would have been an example.
Yeah, I was thinking Alex Galchenyuk, yeah.
Yeah, if I think if Turcotte hadn't come back as early as he did, he might have been undervalued and they probably in the mid part of the first round. And I won't be surprised if he's at top 10, top 5 right now.
Yep.
Brian mentioned earlier that the Vancouver prospect development pipeline is average at best. I don't think anyone would follow the same disagree with that. I'm just curious on your thoughts about what they do differently as compared to a team like Tampa, regardless of having a great prospect development pipeline. Just for the whole panel.
Yeah, it's probably more my bias than anything else, because obviously covering the team pretty closely for the last few years, you kind of get frustrated with seeing players constantly fizzle out. I think that it's a lot of how teams want players to play and what situations they're putting them in. And if we're talking specifically about this year, I think that the Vancouver media has been pretty consistent in their frustration with it because the players have been placed in situations where they're not going to thrive. They're not going to be able to do the things that they did well at previous levels, and are expecting them to be dependable players and do things that they did at the junior level, but there's so much reliance on it that they're not feeling confident as players. So I think that's kind of the problem specifically for that. I think that a lot of teams will put their top players in good situations, understand how to get through to these players, and then continue to work with them throughout, assuming that the players buying in as well. I think that's a huge part that gets understated because we'll throw shade at management, we'll throw it at the people in charge, but I think that there has to be some ownership to the players to understand that they do have to develop their entire game. And if they're not buying in, they're not going to make it.
Yeah, something that I think gets less talked about, but that frustrates me a lot, is that a lot of times there's a focus on improving weaknesses rather than focusing on a player's strengths. And you always want a guy to be able to focus on his strengths. You do not want to make someone develop their defensive game at the expense of their offensive game if you drafted them for their offensive skill. And we see this, I think, too often with offensive defensemen, although less lately, I think. If you've got a defenseman who can skate like the wind and has amazing offensive instincts, why would you want to train him into being a stay-at-home guy?
Yeah.
And some teams still do that.
I agree. Like, it's really great if you give players creative reign to do whatever they want, because otherwise you're killing any potential, a lot of potential they have. Like, I don't know, I was like talking to someone at Michigan, we were talking about Will Lockwood. He was like, well, he makes a lot of mistakes, but he makes a lot of high risk plays. So obviously he's gonna make mistakes. And like, it's great that Mel Pearson allows the kids to do that. I shouldn't call them kids. He allows the players to do that because you have to, I don't know how to say that, but like,
you have to give them room to make mistakes.
yeah, you can't give someone, it's like with kids and like teaching them, like you can't give them extensive rules because then they're gonna get discouraged and stop doing it entirely. And you kill a lot of potential off by doing that. Like, there's some things that you should enforce, yeah, but like you shouldn't change someone's game, or you shouldn't force them to be a specific way, or you shouldn't tell them to not try high risk plays, because that's how they're gonna grow and that's what's gonna differentiate them.
We talk a lot about killing a guy's personality in terms of media, and I think that the same thing can happen with a guy's offensive creativity, depending on the team he's drafted by. If you try to force someone who has just incredible vision into a really rigid structure, I think that makes him less willing to trust his own vision and his own instincts, and you don't want that.
Yeah, and there's like a way to balance it where you can like get a player to be better, more like thinking more defensively. Like I think at Ohio State they've done a good job of that, while also not like killing their potential offensively.
I think with Aiden's presentation yesterday, and I think that the salary cap and people understanding the importance of having players on entry-level contracts, I think it kind of adds to what they're saying there, is that sometimes they're putting too much emphasis on the things that they're weak at, and they're losing seasons. And losing a season at 20, 21 can be killer for careers because they need to get into the NHL as quickly as possible, and then go from there.
Time for one more question.
Yeah, we have time for one more
Choose
question.
wisely.
Yeah, so only good questions. So you better have a really good question. Now I don't know who to pick. Okay, yeah.
Thank you all for being here, first of all. My question is for all of you. Does it make you crazy in any way when you watch the NHL draft and the panel compares a prospect to a particular current NHL player?
Yeah.
I yell a lot. I yell at my TV so much.
And do you think that does it detriment to that player?
Yes.
I think it shapes the perception of players because a lot of people don't follow these prospects closely. I'm sure that, you know, obviously landscapes have changed and people are focusing more on it. But most people don't know who these players are, and if player X is being declared player Y, immediately that's people's expectations from the outside, and then they don't think about it again until a player is coming to the NHL and their game may be different than that snapshot. I get asked a lot of times for comparables to NHL players. One, I'm bad at it, and two, I try to avoid it just because of those expectations, because of, you know, it might be one element or two elements of a game, of a player's game when they're a completely different player.
Yeah, I think the detriment is in public perception and not in the players' play.
Yeah. Yeah, it doesn't make any sense to compare someone to anybody else because everyone is an individual person.
Well, and the game is at a different, like if you're going to compare a guy who's being drafted this year to PK Subban, the game is in a completely different place than it was when Subban was drafted.
I hate anyone comparing a player from like this era to someone who played like 30 years ago. Like you can't compare them because it was completely different back then.
It's not even the same sport anymore.
So ridiculous.
All right, well, I think that was a great way to get that off your chest. So please, thank you so much.